treacherous fogs towards deadly icebergs. It might seem that we should have named it the Titanic instead of the Human Rights Council. If not, we need to take an action today to save the Council from sinking. The composition of the Human Rights Council is as diverse as the world map, as this assembly is. But this council, unlike the assembly, has been established for a specific purpose to promote and protect human rights around the world. And we are in a unique situation now when on the territory of another sovereign state, a member of the Human Rights Council commits horrific human rights violations and abuses that could be equated to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Bucha and dozens of other Ukrainian cities and villages where thousands of peaceful residents have been killed, tortured, raped, abducted, and robbed by the Russian army serve as an example of how dramatically far the Russian Federation has gone from its initial declarations in the human rights domain. That is why this case is unique, and today's response is obvious and self-explanatory. Let me offer you another quote. Our topmost priority is to ensure all human rights and freedoms in their entirety, including political and civil rights and decent socio-economic and environmental living standards. I believe that these questions are not an internal matter of states, but rather their obligations under the UN Charter, the international covenants and conventions. We want to see this approach become a universal norm, end of quote. It is hard to believe that the above quotation belongs to the President of the Russian Federation. Another president, however, and other times. It was said by President Yeltsin in 1992 in his statement at the UN Security Council. We can only regret that the democratic aspirations of the peoples of Russia in early 90s have by Putin's regime been incrementally turned to their opposite. Aggression, hatred, and Soviet-style thinking and reflections, including in the area of human rights and fundamental freedoms. And now we hear completely different statements here in the United Nations from the Russian Federation. This week alone, we hear from the Russian ambassador that there is a warfare in Ukraine and civilians are killed in war. It's being said, as a matter of fact, this Monday, in cold blood and as an absolute normal course of action, also known as quote-unquote special operation. Shall we agree with the describing of killings as something normal? The only healthy answer should be no, in order to contribute to the maintenance of the UN's health and the health of its human rights mechanism. All of you received the Russian diplomatic note yesterday, in which our collective effort to preserve the credibility of the Human Rights Council was considered as an approach to preserve the, I quote, domination and total control in the world, end of quote, and human rights neo-colonial policy in international affairs. We have heard many times the same perverted logic of the aggressor attempting to present itself as a victim, while in fact doing exactly what it cries against in its note, killing citizens of neighboring country, trying to dominate, if it not colonize it. In reply to that, we call on Russia, when its rights of membership in the Human Rights Council are suspended, to return to responsible behavior by implementing the decisions of this Assembly and of Human Rights Council. If Russia expulses itself from the Council, it would be its own choice, and there will be no need to blame others. Suspension of the rights of membership of the Russian Federation in the Human Rights Council is not an option, but a duty. And let me quote how this duty is formulated in the operative paragraph 8 of Resolution 60/251, and I quote, "The General Assembly may suspend the rights of membership in the Council of a member of the Council that commits gross and systematic violations of human rights," end of quote. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's not an option. It is what the resolution prescribes. We view voting to suspend a state's Human Rights Council rights as a rare and extraordinary action. However, Russia's actions are beyond the pale. Russia is not only committing human rights violations, it is shaking the underpinnings of international peace and security. A draft resolution on the matter under A/ES 11/L4 is a result of the collective effort of a cross-regional group of 24 states that represent all regions. It has been co-sponsored so far by more than 50 UN member states. I call upon all responsible member states to support the draft. Let me now once again refer to the commemoration of one of the darkest pages in recent history, the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. On this day of grievances and bearing its own tragedy of thousands of Ukrainians killed by the Russian invaders, Ukraine stands together with Rwanda and calls to reaffirm our pledge to never forget and to never allow the recurrence of genocide, which was a result of the international community's indifference. To those of you who, for this or another reason, opts today to keep being a bystander, to abstain, let me quote Elie Wiesel addressing President Clinton in 1999, talking about the perils of indifference. Indifference elicits no response. Indifference is not a response. Indifference is not a beginning, it is an end. And therefore, indifference is always the friend of the enemy, for it benefits the aggressor, never his victim, whose pain is magnified when he or she feels forgotten. The political prisoner in his cell, the hungry children, the homeless refugees, not to respond to their plight, not to relieve their solitude by offering them a spark of hope, is to exile them from human memory. And in denying their humanity, we betray our own. End of quote. The genocide in Rwanda was largely due to the indifference of the world's community. When the UN did not respond to warnings in the UN Security Council and in General Assembly a year before the tragedy that we commemorate exactly on this day, on the 7th of April. Today, in the case of Ukraine, it's not even a year, because the tragedy is unfolding right now before our eyes. In a couple of minutes, you will have a chance to prove that you are not an indifferent bystander. All you need to do is to press the yes button and to save the Human Rights Council and many lives around the world and in Ukraine. On the other hand, pressing no means pulling a trigger and means a red dot on the screen. Red as the blood of the innocent lives lost. And this image of the red bloody dots on this screen will stay with you and all of us as long as memory does not fail us. Think about it. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ukraine. We shall now proceed to consider draft resolution A/ES-11/L4. Before giving the floor for explanations of vote before the vote, may I remind delegations that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Благодарю вас, господин председатель.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Сейчас не время и не место для
Today is
театрального
not the
пафоса
time or
и
the place for
патетики в
theatrics
стиле представителей
or
Украины.
these
Поэтому я
kinds of
выступлю по существу.
extremely
Рассматриваемый сегодня проект
theatrical
резолюции по факту
performances like
не
the
имеет
one
ничего
presented
общего
by
с
Ukraine.
положением в области
In
прав
fact,
человека.
the draft resolution we're considering today has no relationship to the
Я
actual
повторю
human rights situation
слова нашей ноты,
on the ground.
на которые
like to
сослался
Repeat,
посол Кислицын.
quote our note,
То, что мы
which
видим сегодня,
which
это
the
попытка
ambassador
США
mentioned.
сохранить
What we're seeing today is an
свое
attempt by the
доминирующее
United
положение и
States to
тотальный
maintain its
контроль,
dominant position and total
продолжить
control,
линию на правозащитный колониализм международных
continue
отношений.
its attempt at human rights colonialism in
Часть государств
international
уже
relations.
пребывает в статусе подчиненных.
Part
Тех
of the
же,
member
кто
states are
способен и
already
желает проводить
subordinates.
независимую
Those
внешнюю
who
политику,
wish to
пытаются вытеснить
conduct
на
an
периферии
independent
международной жизни.
foreign policy are there's an attempt to
Сегодня
kind
мы
of
видим,
move them
как
to the
усилению
periphery of
небольшой
international
группы
relations.
стран
Today we're
правозащитная
seeing how
архитектура
through
дала
the efforts
огромную
of a small
трещину.
group of states, the
И эта
human rights
архитектура
architecture
выстраивалась десятилетиями кропотливой работы.
there's a
Напомню,
crack that's
официальный
appeared in that
представитель Генсекретаря
architecture,
ООН
and it was
охарактеризовал
decades
возможное
in the making.
исключение
And the
России из состава СПЧ
Secretary General
как опасный прецедент.
stated that the possible exclusion of Russian Federation from the
Как
Human Rights
показывает
Council
практика,
could be a dangerous precedent.
западные
And
подходы
as practices
по
show,
решению острых
Western
правозащитных
approaches
проблем в
in
отдельных
dealing
странах
with
не
acute human
увенчались
rights
успехом.
problems in certain countries have not really been
Ни один
successful.
конфликт не был
Not a single
урегулирован,
conflict was
а лишь
resolved.
усугубился.
It was only
Во
exacerbated.
многом этому способствовало активное задействование излюбленного западными странами
Was
инструментария в
due to the
виде
use by
диктатов,
Western countries,
санкций и военного вмешательства.
the use of sanctions.
Россия же на протяжении всего своего членства в комиссии и в Совете по правам человека, в Совете ООН по правам человека последовательно отстаивала принцип равноправного и взаимоуважительного сотрудничества государств в качестве главной основы функционирования правозащитной системы. Нашим приоритетом всегда было укрепление конструктивного диалога, вовлечение всех заинтересованных сторон в процесс коллективной выработки и принятия решений в области поощрения и защиты прав человека. Мы отвергаем лживые инсинуации в наш адрес на основе сфабрикованных материалов,
allegations
кадров и
against us based
тиражируемых
on
фейков.
staged events
Господин
and
председатель,
widely circulated fakes.
учитывая вышеизложенное,
Mr.
мы
President, based on
ставим
everything I've said,
проект резолюции на голосование
would
и
like to put
призываем
this
всех
draft resolution
присутствующих
to a
еще раз
vote and call
внимательным
on
образом
all
обдумать свое
those present
решение
here to
и
really
проголосовать
consider your
против
decision and
попытки
to
западных стран и их
vote
союзников
against the attempt by
разрушить
Western countries and their allies
существующую
to destroy
правозащитную
the existing
архитектуру.
human rights architecture.
Я благодарю вас.
Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. I will now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kazakhstan.
The Chair, Kazakhstan closely follows the situation in Ukraine with particular concern and expresses its condolences to the families of those who were killed and wish speedy recovery for those injured during hostilities. We call on all the parties to speedily terminate hostilities and to search for compromises aimed at establishing peace. We also adhere to the position that there is no alternative to a peaceful solution on the problem based on the principles of international law and the UN Charter. Humanitarian situation in Ukraine is dire and needs constant attention, and Kazakhstan has already provided Ukraine with humanitarian aid, sending 3 planes with over 50 tons of medicine and essential goods. Regarding the draft resolution on the suspension of the rights of membership of the Russian Federation in the Human Rights Council, we would like to note the following. First of all, in our opinion, the adoption of this resolution will not contribute to the settlement of the conflict. At the moment, it is extremely important not to undermine the negotiation process. In the current situation, it is necessary for all of us to use diplomatic efforts at all international forums, including Human Rights Council, in order to find ways to resolve the problem as soon as possible. Secondly, according to the paragraph 8 of the resolution on the establishment of Human Rights Council, membership of the Council can be suspended in case of gross and systematic violation of human rights. To establish that case, we need to have results of a transparent, unbiased, and professional investigation. In this regard, we believe that the consideration of today's resolution in the General Assembly must be preceded by a comprehensive investigation of human rights violation in Ukraine, carried out under the framework of relevant international mechanisms. We believe that only after receiving concrete conclusions and reliable information, the General Assembly may consider this issue. In the light of the above mentioned, today we will have to vote against this draft resolution. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Kazakhstan. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Señor presidente, como miembro fundador de las Naciones Unidas, la República Bolivariana de Venezuela está comprometida con los propósitos y principios consagrados en la Carta de nuestra organización, así como con las normas del derecho internacional. Consideramos que la promoción y protección de los derechos humanos debe ser abordada de manera justa y constructiva, sobre la base del diálogo y la cooperación, de acuerdo con los principios de imparcialidad, objetividad, transparencia, no selectividad, no politización y no confrontación. Los derechos humanos no deben ser instrumentalizados para atacar a Estados soberanos, pues tal abordaje socava la esencia misma del sistema universal de derechos humanos, el cual está asociado a garantizar la universalidad, goce y disfrute de estos derechos y libertades fundamentales para todas y todos, sin distinción ni discriminación. Señor presidente, hace un mes en esta asamblea insistimos en la necesidad de que las Naciones Unidas puedan desempeñar un papel central en la facilitación de soluciones pacíficas a los conflictos a través del diálogo y la negociación política. Hoy lamentamos que se haya escogido el camino del escalamiento de las tensiones y se haya profundizado las divisiones entre los miembros de las Naciones Unidas. Ese es el camino equivocado. Alertamos al mundo sobre el peligro real y claro de que la actual situación en la región de Europa del Este se prolongue en el tiempo, generando consecuencias que tardarán generaciones para ser superadas. Alertamos sobre los efectos expansivos alrededor del mundo, especialmente en las condiciones de vida de los sectores más vulnerables en cada país, donde cientos de millones de personas sufren hoy las consecuencias del aumento en los costos de alimentos, de la electricidad y del transporte, así como de la escasez de bienes esenciales provocada por la interrupción de las cadenas internacionales de abastecimiento. Alertamos también sobre el inicio de una nueva carrera armamentista que amenaza con desviar hacia la guerra recursos que deben ser utilizados para el desarrollo y la lucha contra la pobreza. El panorama es terrible, pero el mundo se enfrenta a un peligro aún mayor. Vemos con alarma fuerzas que alientan un choque de bloques con la falsa ilusión de una victoria unipolar definitiva. Un choque que provocará un conflicto mundial entre potencias nucleares que destruirá a la humanidad tal y como la conocemos hoy. Es nuestra obligación reducir las tensiones y fortalecer todas las opciones que permitan la regulación de conflictos y su solución pacífica. Señor presidente, lamentablemente, el proyecto de resolución presentado hoy es un ejemplo de politización de los derechos humanos para avanzar agendas nacionales e intereses geopolíticos. El proyecto trata de expulsar del sistema de derechos humanos a la Federación de Rusia, un país que es parte imprescindible, queramos o no, parte imprescindible en la solución de la crisis de la región de Europa del Este. Sin la Federación Rusa no hay acuerdo de paz posible en Europa. La paz sin Rusia es un espejismo ideológico, una alucinación de los que creen que ha llegado el momento de lograr la victoria definitiva de una potencia unipolar. Esa es una ideología contraria a la paz internacional. Si esta resolución es aprobada, afectará las actuales negociaciones que se llevan a cabo entre las partes y nos empujará deliberadamente a una fase más aguda del conflicto, una fase más larga y difícil de resolver. Señor presidente, otro resultado inmediato de la aprobación de la resolución será la fractura histórica del mejor instrumento creado para defender los derechos humanos en el mundo, como es el Consejo de Derechos Humanos. Una vez perdidos los equilibrios existentes, se afectará su credibilidad, su función y su mandato. Estaremos creando una crisis sistémica de confianza que terminaría por afectar a las Naciones Unidas como organización universal capaz de gestionar crisis regionales y mundiales y de trabajar como un verdadero instrumento para la paz. Señor presidente, por todo lo anterior, la República de Venezuela rechaza categóricamente los intentos por suspender a la Federación de Rusia como miembro electo del Consejo de Derechos Humanos y hace un llamado a los miembros responsables de la comunidad internacional a votar en contra de la resolución. Muchas gracias.
I thank the distinguished representative of Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
President, my delegation expressed deep concern to current development of political situation in Ukraine. Also, we are very concerned that some countries continue to push confrontation and distrust among member states instead of giving priority to ease tension and seek political and peaceful solution to resolve current crisis in Ukraine. We reject any politically motivated initiative, lack of objectivity, impartiality, and transparency. The alleged accusation of the cruel atrocity against the civil population in Ukraine, including a relevant report and image of the civilian deaths in Bucha, have not surely verified and proved based on the real fact and objective evidence. Prior to considering the draft resolution before us, the independent investigation must be made, and for this, sufficient time and efforts are required. However, some member states are acting and moving very recklessly for their political goals by submitting such draft resolution. Such political and unilateral action do not help to solve the problem at all. We take note of the efforts of the Russian Federation to address the humanitarian situation in and around Ukraine. Draft resolution is nothing but another example of the product of the political confrontation aiming at tarnishing one member state at the UN stage. For this reason, my delegation against draft resolutions contain document A/ES-11/L4. I thank you, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Democratic People's Republic of Korea. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
The Islamic Republic of Iran has, on a number of occasions, expressed its principled position with regard to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, including during the adoption of the two previous resolutions of the 11th Emergency Special Session of the United Nations General Assembly. My delegation would like to underline once again the need for peaceful settlement of disputes in accordance with international law and for the full respect by all parties for the well-established provisions of the United Nations Charter and international law, including international humanitarian law. We emphasize that sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states must be fully respected and the safety and security of all civilians must be guaranteed. Iran remains deeply concerned about the continuous deterioration of the humanitarian situation in and around Ukraine, which has sparked significant alarm in the international community. We call for an immediate cessation of hostilities and emphasize the importance of complying with international humanitarian law by all parties. We repeat our call for unimpeded humanitarian access to all areas of the armed conflict in Ukraine. The humanitarian needs of the affected population must be addressed immediately, and the delivery of food, medicine, and other essential services to the people in need must be facilitated. The international community should encourage and support continued direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine until peace is restored. The Islamic Republic of Iran once again calls for de-escalation of tensions in the current conflict and an urgent and lasting solution to this crisis through dialogue. Mr. President, we consider the text of the resolution before the General Assembly contained in document L3 as politically driven, which undermines the impartiality of our organization. My government attaches great importance to the promotion and protection of human rights. However, we are against the exploitation of UN human rights machinery for political ends, which contravenes the principles of universality, non-selectivity, and objectivity in addressing human rights issues. We have always maintained that human rights should not be undermined by short-sighted political considerations. We stress that the work of the Human Rights Council should be performed in a non-confrontational and non-politicized manner, and membership in this body should not be politicized. We would like to reiterate our position on the centrality of the principles of objectivity, dialogue, and cooperation towards the protection and promotion of all human rights based on a non-selective and non-politicized approach. We are of the view that the exploitation of paragraph 8 of UN General Assembly Resolution 60/251 deepens confrontation and attenuates constructive dialogue between countries. For the above-mentioned reasons, my delegation will vote against the draft resolution contained in document L4. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr.
سيد
President.
الرئيس مجددا
Mr. President,
يشهد هذا المنبر
once again,
الدولي الهام
this important
استغلالا لمسائل
international
حقوق
forum
الإنسان لخدمة
witnesses
المصالح
the
السياسية الضيقة
exploitation
لبعض
of
الدول
human rights in the
وخلق
service of
حالة من
political
الاستقطاب
interests of
والتسييس
some
باستهداف الاتحاد
countries
الروسي
and the
بذريعة
creation of
التعامل مع الأوضاع
polarization and
الإنسانية
politicization
في أوكرانيا.
targeting the Russian Federation
وفدي يؤكد
on the
الحرص على
pretext of
ضمان
dealing
احترام
with
حقوق
humanitarian
الإنسان
issues in their
وأهمية تقديم
My
المساعدة
delegation stresses the
الإنسانية
importance of
الضرورية
guaranteeing
لجميع
and
مناطق
respecting human
الأزمات،
rights and the importance of providing
لكنه في الوقت نفسه
necessary humanitarian
يرفض أي
assistance to
تسييس
all crisis
للمسائل
areas.
الإنسانية
Yet, at the same time,
ويشدد
we
على
reject any
أهمية اعتماد
politicization of
مبادئ
humanitarian
الحياد
issues and
والموضوعية
stress the importance
وعدم
of adopting
التمييز
the
في
principles
قضايا
of
حقوق الإنسان.
impartiality objectivity
سيد
and
الرئيس،
non-discrimination in
إن
human
هذا
rights
التحرك
issues.
الغربي
Mr.
المنسق
President, this
للتشهير
coordinated
بالاتحاد
Western
الروسي
move to denounce
لا
the Russian
علاقة له
Federation
بحقوق الإنسان في أوكرانيا
has no
أو في أي
relation
مكان
to human
آخر،
rights in the Ukraine
وإنما
or
يندرج
anywhere
في
else.
إطار سعي دول
Rather,
غربية
it is an effort
لفرض
by
هيمنتها
Western countries to
وسيطرتها على
impose their
العالم،
hegemony and control over
وذلك
the
من
world
خلال محاصرة روسيا
through besieging
ومعاقبتها
Russia
على سياساتها
and
الخارجية
its
المستقلة.
punishment for its independent
فعندما
foreign
دمرت
policy.
الولايات المتحدة
When the
الأمريكية
United States of
وحلفائها
America and its
مدينة الرقة
allies
السورية
destroyed the
وقتلت
Syrian city
الآلاف
of
من
Raqqa
الأبرياء فيها،
and killed thousands of
لم
innocent
نرى هذا
people
الحشد
there,
السياسي
we did
والإعلامي
not
الدولي
see
لفضح
such
منتهكي حقوق
international
الإنسان.
media and political mobilization to expose
إن
the
قرار الجمعية
perpetrators
العامة
of human rights violations.
رقم 60 على
General
251
Assembly Resolution 60/251
المنشئ لمجلس حقوق الإنسان
establishing the Human
أكد على
Rights
أن
Council
جميع حقوق الإنسان
stressed
عالمية
that all human
وغير
rights
قابلة
are
للتجزئة
universal,
ومترابطة
indivisible,
ومتشابكة،
interlinked,
وأنه يتعين
and
معاملة
intertwined,
جميع حقوق
and that
الإنسان
they should
معاملة
be
منصفة
treated
وعادلة
in a
وعلى
just
عدم
and
المساواة
equitable way
وبالقدر نفسه
on the same
من
footing
الاهتمام.
and with the same degree of concern.
إلا أن الممارسة العملية التي شهدناها منذ
However,
إنشاء هذا
The
المجلس
practice that
وحتى
we have
الآن
seen since the establishment
تثبت
of that
تبني
council
بعض الدول
until now
الغربية للتسييس
proves the adoption by
والانتقائية
certain Western
والمعايير
countries of
المزدوجة في
politicization,
التعامل مع قضايا
selectivity,
حقوق
and
الإنسان،
double standards in dealing with human
إذ
rights issues.
تركز على حالات دول
They
بعينها
focus on
بما يخدم
the
أغراضها السياسية،
situations of
وفي نفس
certain
الوقت
countries
تغض الطرف
in a
عن
manner
حالات
that
أخرى
serves their
تم
political
فيها
purposes.
ارتكاب
At
انتهاكات
the same
جسيمة
time, they
وممنهجة
disregard other
لحقوق الإنسان
situations where
على مرأى
grave
ومسمع
human
العالم
rights
أجمع،
violations,
وما
systemic and
يتعرض
grave human
له
rights
الشعب الفلسطيني
violations
على مدى عقود
were
على يد قوات الاحتلال
perpetrated
الإسرائيلية
in the full
أوضح دليل
sound and
على
sight
ذلك.
of the world, and what the
والمثال
Palestinian
الآخر
people has been exposed to for
على نفاق
decades
تلك الدول
at the hands of
وتجاهلها
the
لحقوق
Israeli
وأمن
occupation
وسلامة
forces is the
المدنيين
best proof of
بما
that.
فيهم الأطفال والنساء
Another
في
example
دونباس
is on the
الذين تعرضوا لحملة
hypocrisy
عدائية
of
ممنهجة
those states
وقصف
is their
مستمر بعدة
disregard
سنوات.
for the
فلماذا
safety,
لم نشهد
security,
مثل هذا التحرك الغربي من أجل
and
حمايتهم
protection
والدفاع
of
عن حقوقهم؟
civilians, including women
إن
and children in
تذرع
Donbass
الساعين
who have
وراء
been
هذا
shelled
التحرك
and
بنص الفقرة
who
الثامنة
have
من
been
قرار
attacked for
إنشاء
years. We haven't seen
مجلس
such a
حقوق
move.
الإنسان
At the same time,
يثير
the
قلقا جديا
invocation of
حول
the
ماهية
pretext
القرائن التي تم
of
الاستناد
paragraph
عليها
8 of
في
the
الحديث
resolution
عن ارتكاب
establishing the Human
انتهاكات
Rights Council
جسيمة
is a
ومنهجية
major source of
لحقوق
concern,
الإنسان،
since we have not seen any
وما
evidence
مدى مصداقية المصادر
base
التي تم الاعتماد
such talk
عليها،
about grave
وما هي
violations of human
الآليات
rights.
الدولية
What is the
المحايدة
credibility
التي
of the
أكدت
sources
وقوع
of such
مثل تلك
information? What
الانتهاكات
are the
وحددت
impartial
هوية
international
مرتكبيها؟
mechanisms that were
إن قيام بعض الدول بإطلاق
providing such
الاتهامات
information or proving
والترويج
their
لها عبر دعاية
perpetration?
مضللة من خلال
The
نشر صور
launching
وفيديوهات
of
مجهولة المصدر
accusations and
والمكان
the spreading of
ونشرها
such
عبر المصادر المفتوحة لا يمكن أن
accusations
يكون
through
أساسا
misleading
متينا كي
media
تتخذ الجمعية
and
العامة قرارا بشأنها.
the photographs and videos
وكما في الحالة
whose
السورية
sources and places are
فإن
unknown
جلسات
and
مجلس
their
الأمن والجمعية
spreading
العامة
through open
يجب أن
sources
تسبقها
cannot be
دائما
basis for
مسرحيات
for
واستفزازات،
General Assembly
وهو ما
action
نشهده
on the
الآن
issue.
في الحالة
As in the
الأوكرانية،
Syrian situation,
وذلك
Security
لتبرير
Council
القرارات
and General
التي تخطط
Assembly
الدول الغربية
meetings are
والمعادية
always preceded
لاتخاذها
with
باسم شرعيتهم الدولية
theatrical
المزعومة.
provocations, such as we witness in the
سيد
Ukraine,
الرئيس،
to justify decisions
إن مشروع
planned by
القرار
Western
المعروض
and
أمامنا
hostile
اليوم
countries
ينطوي على حالة خطيرة من
in the name
العدائية
of international
ومثال
legitimacy.
واضح على
Mr.
انتهاج
President,
سياسة الإقصاء
the draft resolution before us
التي
today
لطالما
involves a
حذرت منها
serious case
بلادنا.
of hostility and a
فتعليق
clear
عضوية
example
الاتحاد الروسي في
of the
مجلس حقوق
adoption
الإنسان
of exclusion of
سيكون
which
له
we have
تأثير
warned.
سلبي على
The
حالة
suspension
التوازن
of
فيه
the membership of the
وعلى
Russian Federation
عالميته
in the Human
وفاعلية
Rights
دوره.
Council will have an adverse
إذ أن
effect
هذا
on its
التعليق
balance, its
سيعزز
universality,
هيمنة
and the
مجموعة من
effectiveness
الدول
of its
الغربية
role.
على هذا
Such
الجهاز الهام
suspension will
وفرض رؤيتها
enhance the
ومعاييرها
hegemony
في
of a
مجال
group of
حقوق
Western
الإنسان
countries on this important body.
واستخدامها
They will
كأداة
impose their vision
للضغط
and their
السياسي واستهداف
criteria
دول
for
بعينها.
human rights, and
وإذا
which will
كنا
be used as a tool
وإذا
of
كنا
political
أكثر
pressure
صراحة
and the
وشفافية
targeting of certain countries
فإننا
to be
نرى في
more
مثل
frank and
هذه
transparent.
الممارسات
We believe
تهديدا
that such
لوجود منظومة
practices
الأمم المتحدة
represent
ذاتها.
a threat to the existence of the United
بناء
Nations
عليه
organization itself.
وانطلاقا من موقفه
Therefore,
الثابت والراسخ
and
في
proceeding
رفض
from
جميع
our firm
محاولات
and
تسييس
principled
حقوق الإنسان
position in
والتلاعب
rejecting
بها،
all attempts to
سيصوت
politicize
وفدي
human
ضد
rights,
مشروع القرار قيد
we will
النظر
vote against the
ويحث
resolution
الوفود
before
الأخرى
us, and we urge other
على التنبه
delegations
لمخاطر
to
الانجرار
beware
وراء
of the
مساعي
dangers of
الصدام
embracing
والعزل والاستعداء،
these efforts at
ويدعو إلى رفض
confrontation,
سياسة المعايير
isolation, and
المزدوجة
hostility.
والنأي
We
بمواضيع
call
حقوق
for the
الإنسان
rejection of
عن
double
أي
standards
اعتبارات
and
سياسية.
to keep human rights issues
وإذا
away
أرادت
from
دولنا
all political considerations.
استمرار وبقاء الأمم المتحدة
If we want the
فعلينا
United
جميعا
Nations to
أن نقول
continue
لا
and survive, we
لمثل
should
هذه
all say
القرارات.
no to such resolutions.
شكرا السيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Syrian Arab Republic. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba.
Señor presidente, Cuba ha abogado y trabajado siempre
Mr.
por un
President,
Consejo de Derechos
Cuba has
Humanos
always
capaz de
advocated
enfrentar
for and
los
worked
complejos
toward a
retos
human
que
rights
tiene la
council
comunidad
capable of
internacional en
facing
esta
the
materia,
challenges of
de
the
los que
international
ningún país
community in this
está
area.
exento.
No country is exempt.
Defendemos la
We
objetividad,
defend
imparcialidad
the
y
objectivity,
transparencia en las labores de
impartiality,
ese
and
órgano
transparency in the
y que sus
work of that
procedimientos
body.
y mecanismos
Its
trabajen
procedures and
sobre la base de
mechanisms should
información
work on the
veraz
basis
y
of
contrastada.
true
El
information.
uso de la cláusula
The
de
use
suspensión de la
of
membresía
the
del Consejo
clause
en modo
on
alguno
suspension of
favorecerá la
membership in
búsqueda
the
de una
council
solución
will
pacífica,
not favor
negociada y
finding a
duradera
peaceful,
al conflicto en
lasting,
Ucrania,
and
y mucho menos
negotiated
ayudará a
solution to
fomentar el
the
clima de
conflict
cooperación,
in Ukraine. It
diálogo y
will,
entendimiento que debe
it will
primar al
not
abordarse la
promote
cuestión
the
de los derechos humanos.
dialogue and understanding
Es
which should be
irrespetuoso,
prevalent
además,
in human rights
que a tan
issues.
solo unos días de
Only a
concluir
few
un periodo
days after
ordinario de
concluding
sesiones
a
del
regular
Consejo de
session
Derechos
of
Humanos,
the Human
ni
Rights
siquiera se le
Council,
haya dado la oportunidad a ese órgano
that
de
body was not
pronunciarse
even given
al
the
respecto.
opportunity to state
Señor presidente,
its position.
desde que se inició el
Mr.
proceso de
President, since the
negociaciones
start of the
sobre la
negotiating
construcción del
process
nuevo
on
Consejo
the building
que
of
sucedería
the
a la
new
Comisión de
council that
Derechos
would
Humanos,
follow the
Cuba se
Human
opuso a la
Rights
cláusula
Commission,
de
Cuba
suspensión de la
opposed
membresía
the clause on
debido al serio
suspension of
riesgo de que la
membership, given
misma
the serious
fuese
risk
utilizada por
that it could
determinados
be
países
used by
que
specific
privilegian el
countries
doble rasero,
which favor
la
a double
selectividad
standard,
y la politización
selectivity and
de los temas de
politicization
derechos
of
humanos.
human rights issues.
Esa cláusula puede ser
That
activada
clause
con el apoyo de
can
apenas
be
2/3 de los
activated
presentes y
with the support
votantes.
of only
Por
2/3 of
tanto,
those present and
las
voting.
abstenciones no cuentan
Therefore,
y ni
abstentions
siquiera
do
se
not
establece
count, and there's
un
not
mínimo
even a
requerido de
minimum
votos para que se apruebe la
established of
suspensión.
votes required for
Para ser
approving
electo miembro
suspension.
del Consejo de
To be
Derechos
elected a
Humanos,
member of the Human
un
Rights
país
Council,
necesita
a
obtener como
country
mínimo
needs to
en
obtain
votación
as a
secreta
minimum
el
in a
apoyo de la
secret
mayoría de
ballot
los
the
miembros de la
support
ONU,
of the majority
es
of the
decir,
members of the
al
United
menos
Nations, that is to
97
say,
votos.
at least
De tal
97
manera,
votes.
los derechos de un miembro
Thus,
del Consejo
the
pueden ser
rights of a member
suspendidos
of the council
por la
can be
voluntad de un
suspended
número de estados
by the
menor
will
de los que
of
decidieron
a
elegirlo
number
y
of
otorgarle
states lower
esos
than the number
derechos.
of states which
La
granted
Federación de
those
Rusia,
rights.
que
The
fue electa como
Russian
miembro del
Federation, which was
Consejo de
elected
Derechos
as a
Humanos
member of the
en el
Human
año
Rights Council in
2020 con
2020 with
158 votos,
158
hoy pudiera
votes,
ser suspendida
could be
con
suspended
una cantidad
today
inferior.
with by a
Ese
lower
mecanismo
number
de
of votes.
suspensión,
That
que no tiene
suspension
paralelo en
mechanism,
ningún otro
which has
órgano
no
de las
parallel
Naciones
in
Unidas,
any other
puede
body
ser
of the United
fácilmente
Nations,
utilizado de manera
could
selectiva.
be easily used
Hoy es Rusia,
selectively.
pero
It
mañana
is
puede
Russia
ser
today,
cualquiera de
but
nuestros
tomorrow
países,
it could be any of our
particularmente naciones del
countries,
sur,
especially
que no se pliegan a los
nations of the
intereses de
South, which do
dominación
not
y
support
que
the
defienden con
interests of
firmeza
domination and which
su
firmly
independencia.
defend their independence.
No fue casualidad que los más
It
entusiastas
was not by
promotores de la
chance that
cláusula
the
de
more
suspensión de la
enthusiastic
membresía,
promoters of the
cuando se
suspension
negociaba la
clause,
construcción
when
del nuevo Consejo
negotiating
de Derechos
the
Humanos,
new Human
fueron
Rights
naciones
Council,
desarrolladas
were
con
developed
demostrada tendencia
nations with
a
a
acusar a países
clear
del sur
trend to
que no
accuse
se
countries
ajustan
of the
a sus
South
supuestos
which
modelos
do
de
not
democracia, mientras
follow their
permanecen en silencio
alleged models
cómplice
of democracy,
ante flagrantes
while
violaciones de derechos humanos en países occidentales. Por supuesto, no todos en esta sala comparten nuestras preocupaciones sobre el mecanismo de suspensión, pues saben que las víctimas de su uso selectivo siempre serán otros. ¿Podría esta Asamblea aprobar algún día una resolución suspendiendo la membresía de Estados Unidos en el Consejo de Derechos Humanos? Por poner solo un ejemplo, todos sabemos que eso no ha sucedido ni sucederá. A pesar de sus violaciones flagrantes y masivas de los derechos humanos como consecuencia de invasiones y guerras de rapiña contra estados soberanos en función de sus intereses geopolíticos, han ocasionado la muerte de cientos de miles de civiles que denominan daños colaterales, millones de desplazados y vasta destrucción en toda la geografía de nuestro planeta. Pero esta Asamblea jamás ha suspendido ninguno de sus derechos. También sabemos todos que no se aplicará la cláusula de suspensión contra el Estado que ha impuesto contra Cuba por más de 60 años un criminal bloqueo económico, comercial y financiero que constituye sin dudas la más prolongada, flagrante, masiva y sistemática violación de los derechos humanos de todo un pueblo y un verdadero acto de genocidio contra todo un país. Resulta cuando menos irónico observar que el país que se opuso al establecimiento del Consejo de Derechos Humanos y solicitó en esta misma sala el voto en contra de la resolución que lo creó, es el mismo que ha activado a su conveniencia ahora, como lo hizo en 2011, una de las cláusulas más controversiales de ese foro. Señor presidente, Cuba será consecuente con las reservas que realizó respecto al mecanismo de suspensión de la membresía al adoptarse en el año 2006 la resolución 60/251 que estableció el Consejo de Derechos Humanos y la 65/265 de 2011 sobre la suspensión de derechos de Libia. La aprobación del proyecto de resolución que hoy consideramos sentará un peligroso precedente adicional, en particular para el sur. No les basta con imponer resoluciones contra países y mandatos selectivos. Ahora se proponen dar un nuevo paso de avance en la legitimación de la selectividad y la conformación de un Consejo de Derechos Humanos cada vez más al servicio de determinados países, como lo estuvo en su momento la extinta y desacreditada Comisión de Derechos Humanos. Por las razones expuestas, la delegación cubana votará en contra del proyecto de resolución contenido en el documento L4. Gracias.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cuba. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Senegal.
Monsieur le Président, à l'instar de la communauté internationale, le Sénégal reste profondément
Just as the rest
préoccupé
of the international community,
par le
Senegal
lourd
is
bilan de la
profoundly
guerre en Ukraine,
concerned by
qui a déjà occasionné
the
de nombreux morts,
terrible
ainsi
cost
que
of
des
the
millions de
war in Ukraine,
réfugiés
which has already
et de
led
déplacés.
to thousands of
À ce
deaths,
sombre tableau
refugees, and IDPs.
s'ajoutent des
To this
allégations de
somber
graves
picture
violations des droits de l'homme.
can be added allegations of
En
severe
tout temps et en
violations of
tout
human
lieu,
rights.
la guerre est une faillite pour
Everywhere
l'humanité.
and throughout history,
Le Sénégal est
war
pour
is a
la paix
failure
en
of
Ukraine,
humanity.
au nom
Senegal is
d'une
in favor
humanité sans
of
frontières.
peace in Ukraine.
Le Sénégal est également pour la paix en
Senegal
Ukraine parce que nos
is
pays
also
sont
in
des
favor of
victimes
Ukraine,
collatérales
of peace
de
in
cette
Ukraine,
crise de
because our
portée
countries are
mondiale
collateral
en raison
victims
de
of
ces
this
graves
global crisis
conséquences,
due to its
de ces
severe
conséquences
consequences,
particulièrement graves sur nos économies et nos populations.
particularly serious for our economies and our people.
Le Sénégal est pour la désescalade,
Senegal is
pour
for
l'arrêt immédiat des
de-escalation,
hostilités en
for the
Ukraine
immediate
et
stoppage
la
of
poursuite des
hostilities in
négociations
Ukraine, and
en
for
vue de parvenir à une solution
negotiations in order
pacifique
to
et
reach a
durable de la
peaceful and
crise.
lasting solution to the crisis.
C'est le sens du communiqué publié le 24
This
février
is the essence of
2022
the communique
par son
published on the
Excellence, Monsieur le
24th of
Président
February
Macky Sall,
2022 by His
en sa
Excellency
qualité de
President
président
Macky
en
Sall in
exercice
his
de l'Union
capacity
africaine,
as the
de concert avec le président de la
current
Commission de
President of
l'UA,
the African Union.
communiqua communiqué appelant, je cite,
This is a
au
communique
respect
that calls, and I quote,
impératif du
for
droit
the
international,
imperative respect of
de
international
l'intégrité
law,
territoriale
the
et de
territorial
la souveraineté de
integrity
l'Ukraine.
and
Fin de
sovereignty of
citation.
Ukraine. End of quote.
C'est aussi le sens du soutien du
This
Sénégal
is
à la
also
résolution
the
ES
purpose of Senegal's support for
11/2 de la
resolution
session spéciale
11/2
de
of the
l'Assemblée
special
générale du
session
24
of the
mars
General Assembly
2022
of the
sur
24th
les
of March of
conséquences
this year
humanitaires de
on
la
the
guerre en Ukraine.
humanitarian consequences
C'est
of the war in
également le
Ukraine.
sens de
It's
notre vote
also
en faveur de la
the
résolution
what's behind our vote in favor of
A/HRC/49/1
resolution
du Conseil des droits de l'homme
49/1 of the
du 4
Human
mars
Rights Council
2022
of the 4th of
sur la
March of this
situation des
year
droits de l'homme
on
en
the
Ukraine
human rights
et
situation
portant
in
notamment
Ukraine,
mise en
and in
place d'une
particular
commission d'enquête
establishing a
internationale
international
sur
commission
les
of
allégations de
inquiry on
violations
the
des droits de
allegation
l'homme
of violations
dans
of
le
human
pays
rights
consécutivement à la
in
guerre.
the country as a result of the war.
Nous estimons que c'est la
We believe
publication des
that
conclusions de
is the
cette commission
publication of the
qui nous donnera
conclusions
une
of
vue
this
complète
commission
de la
that will give us
nature
a
et
full
de l'ampleur des
overview
violations
of
alléguées.
the nature and the
Cette vue
scope of
complète
the violations.
nous
This
donnera par conséquent
overview will
la
therefore
mesure exacte des
give us
sanctions
the
à envisager.
exact type of
Or, la
sanctions that should
présente
be envisaged.
résolution
Now, this resolution
décide de mesures de sanctions sans que la
decides
commission d'enquête que
on
nous
a,
avons mise en place
sanction
n'ait
measures
rendu ses conclusions,
before the inquiry commission that
anticipant
we've
ainsi sur le
established
travail attendu d'elle.
delivers its outcome. So it anticipates on the
Tenant
work of this
compte
commission.
de toutes ces
Bearing in
considérations,
mind all these
le Sénégal
considerations,
votera
Senegal
abstention sur ce texte
will abstain on
pour
voting for
rester
this text
cohérent avec la
to
résolution
be
du Conseil
consistent
des droits
with
de l'homme
the
du 4 mars
resolutions of the
2022
Human Rights Council of the
portant
4th
mise
of
en
March,
place d'une commission d'enquête
setting up an
internationale
international commission
sur
of
les
inquiry
allégations
on
de
the
violation des droits de l'homme en Ukraine.
human rights
Je vous
violations
remercie.
in Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Senegal. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa.
Mr. President, South Africa is deeply concerned about the continuing conflict in Ukraine, the loss of lives, and the deteriorating humanitarian situation. We reiterate our view that as a matter of urgency, there must be a cessation of hostilities, which would be the first step in a comprehensive response to the humanitarian crisis. South Africa stresses once again that dialogue, mediation, and diplomacy is the only path to end the current conflict. Wars end when dialogues begin, and wars endure when there is no dialogue. In this regard, we welcome the efforts by Ukraine and Russia to hold talks without preconditions. South Africa expresses the hope that both parties will use diplomacy to de-escalate the situation in Ukraine, leading to a durable political and security situation. We maintain that all parties have much to gain from a negotiated outcome and much to lose from unnecessary and violent conflict. The General Assembly must therefore encourage mediation and dialogue and adopt constructive outcomes leading to that. Mr. President, South Africa is deeply concerned at the reports of civilian casualties in Ukraine. As the international community, we cannot be indifferent to the killing and suffering of civilians. The humanitarian crisis that has resulted from the ongoing military operations must be addressed, and there must be an urgent opening of humanitarian corridors and the provision of aid to the civilian population, which, as usual, bears the brunt of the suffering when violent confrontation breaks out. All parties to the conflict must comply with international human rights and humanitarian law, including the Geneva Conventions, and must respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all member states in keeping with the UN Charter. Mr. President, on 4th March 2022, the Human Rights Council adopted a resolution authorizing the establishment of an international commission of inquiry to investigate all alleged violations and abuses of human rights and violations of international law and related crimes in Ukraine. The Commission has not yet commenced its work, and we await its findings on the allegations of gross violations and abuses of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law. South Africa is of the firm belief that the tabling of the resolution that we will consider today is premature and prejudges the outcomes of the Commission of Inquiry. We must allow the Commission to urgently undertake its mandate and report to the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly on its outcomes. It is also imperative that all parties to the conflict must allow the Commission to perform its duties without any hindrance and interference. Mr. President, we recall Resolution 60251, which is the basis of the resolution before us and which established the Human Rights Council, also recognizes inter alia, I quote, the importance of ensuring universality, objectivity, and non-selectivity in the consideration of human rights issues and the elimination of double standards and politicization, close quote. Unfortunately, the resolution that we are considering today will further divide and polarize the matter and the General Assembly itself without following due process. South Africa maintains that in considering the suspension of a member of the Human Rights Council, we must be consistent and not selective, as this would undermine the credibility of the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council. For these reasons, South Africa will abstain on the resolution. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of South Africa. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt.
سيد الرئيس
Mr. President,
مصر لا تنظر إلى مشروع القرار
Egypt
المطروح
does not view the draft resolution before us
بأزمة أوكرانيا
as
أو
a
مبدأ عدم
resolution
جواز اللجوء إلى
related
القوة
to
المسلحة
the situation in
أو
the
المساس
Ukraine, the
بسيادة
principle
الدول
of non-use
وإنما
of
باعتباره مرتبطا
force
بالتوجه
in
نحو تسييس
relations
أجهزة
amongst
الأمم
nations.
المتحدة ووكالاتها
We
المتخصصة
rather are concerned
وإن الموقف المصري
of the
المبدئي والثابت
functions and mandates of
إنما
United
يرفض
Nations
هذا
bodies. Our
التوجه
principal
لما
position
ينطوي عليه
rejects the
من
current
إهدار للغرض الذي
tendency
أنشئت من أجله المنظمة
since it undermines the purposes for which the organization,
وما
its
يقود
bodies
إليه
and
ذلك
agencies were
من
established,
دحض
as well
لمصداقيتها
as
وللعمل الدولي متعدد
its
الأطراف
credibility and multilateral
وتعتبر
work.
مصر
Egypt
أن ما نحن
considers
بصدده اليوم
that
اتصالا بطرح
what
مشروع
we are
القرار
doing today
يمثل
in considering
منعطفا
the draft
خطيرا
resolution
في مسار
represents
منظمة الأمم المتحدة
a
على مدى
serious
عمرها.
crossroads for the United Nations in its
إن احترام
entire
المنظمة
existence.
لميثاقها
The
وقواعدها
organization's respect for its
ونظام
charter, its
عملها
rules
قد
of
عزز
procedure,
من
and its
اعتماد
methods of
المجتمع
work
الدولي عليها من أجل ترسيخ منظومة العمل الدولي
led the international
استناداً
community to
إلى
rely
قواعد
on it in all
وآليات
international issues
يحتكم
based
إليها
on rules and
لحسن
regulations
إدارة العلاقات الدولية
that are
والحفاظ
applied
على
in the
السلم
conduct
والأمن
of
الدوليين
international relations with a
وهو
view
ما
to
يعد
preserving
مهدداً
international
الآن.
peace and security. Peace and
سيد
security that
الرئيس
are in
إن
danger
مشروع
at
القرار
this moment.
المطروح إنما يعد
The
إهداراً
current draft resolution
لآليات المنظمة التي طالما كانت
undermines the
محل ثقة أعضاء
methods
المجتمع
of
الدولي
work of the organization
ومؤشرا
that have
ينذر
enjoyed
ببدء
the trust of the
اهتزاز
international
مصداقية
community
الأمم
and
المتحدة
threatens
وآلياتها
to undermine
وهو
the
الأمر
credibility
الذي
of the
سيكون
United
له
Nations and its organizations,
تداعيات بالغة
leading
الآثار السلبية على قدرتها على
to
الاطلاع
further negative
بمسؤولياتها
repercussions
وفقاً
on the organization's
لميثاقها
ability to fulfill
ومستقر من عمل
its role
بشأنه
in
على
accordance
مدى
with its charter
75 عام.
and as it has done
سيد
for
الرئيس تعرض
75
مصر
years.
عن عدم الارتياح البالغ
Egypt
إزاء استمرار المعايير المزدوجة والكيل بأكثر من
does not
مكيال
feel comfortable with
فكم من
double
المرات
standards
تم الاكتفاء
and
بقرارات أقل
partiality.
حسما وأكثر تساهلا إزاء
Many
انتهاكات
times
لحقوق
before,
الإنسان واضحة في ماض ليس بالبعيد.
such resolutions were not
هذا
adopted
وتؤكد
in
مصر
cases of
في
human
ذلك
rights
السياق
violations
رفضها الكامل
that
في ذات الوقت
are not
لأي انتهاكات جسيمة لحقوق
so far
الإنسان
back in time.
وخرق التزامات
We are
الدول
concerned
القانونية في هذا الصدد.
with the
وترى
violations
ضرورة
of human
مواجهة
rights and the
مثل
obligations of
هذه
all states
الخروقات
in this
الجسيمة
regard. And we believe
بشكل
that such
حاسم
serious
وفقا
violations
للآليات الأممية
should be dealt with
التي تكفل التصدي
decisively
لتلك
in
الأعمال
accordance with
المشينة
the United Nations
واتخاذ القرار
rules and
الملائم
procedures
لمواجهتها. سيد
in
الرئيس، بناء
an
على
adequate
هذه
manner.
الدفوع والاعتبارات التي
Based
تم عرضها لا
on
ترى
all
مصر
of this,
وجاهة
Egypt
لطرح مشروع
does not
القرار
believe that
وتتحسب
the draft
لآثاره.
resolution is being
وشكراً
proposed at the
سيد
right
الرئيس.
moment, and we warn of it. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Egypt. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil.
Mr. President, distinguished delegates, we are deeply concerned about allegations of gross violations of human rights and humanitarian law in Ukraine, including recent reports coming from the region of Bucha. The images of extreme violence against civilians and the high number of deaths, many of them with signs of torture and ill treatment, are profoundly disturbing. Our deep sympathy goes to all victims and their families. The Human Rights Council created last month a commission of inquiry with a mandate to establish the facts and circumstances that may amount to violations and abuses of human rights and of humanitarian law in Ukraine. We call on all parties to cooperate with the Commission so that it can fulfill its mandate and provide us with an unbiased and precise information on the situation on the ground. Brazil has decided to abstain in today's vote as it believes the Commission of Inquiry should be allowed to complete its independent investigation so that responsibilities can be ascertained. Only then would this General Assembly be in a position to better assess and take a responsible and informed decision on the status of Russia in the Council. We must at all costs avoid repeating the mistakes of the old Commission on Human Rights, particularly concerning politicization, double standards, and selectivity, which had been the main flaw of the previous human rights system and the object of well-founded criticism of its work. The Human Rights Council should be guided by the imperative of inclusive dialogue as the main instrument for cooperation, sustainable solutions, and peace. Mr. President, Brazil is fully committed to finding ways to an immediate cessation of hostilities and to promoting a real dialogue conducive to a peaceful and sustainable solution. Ensuring respect for human rights and humanitarian law, protecting civilians, calling for peace. These are the objectives that should unite rather than divide us. There is no alternative to a negotiated solution and to a constructive and balanced approach aimed at preserving spaces of dialogue. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Brazil. I now wish to invite the distinguished representative of China.
Thank you, Mr. President.
主席先生，
Mr. President,
在乌克兰问题
on
上，
the Ukraine
中
issue,
方始终
China
主张，
always believes that
包
the
括乌克兰在内的各
sovereignty
国
and
主权和
territorial
领土完整
integrity of all countries,
都应得到
including
尊重。
Ukraine, should be respected.
联合国宪
That
章
the
宗旨和
purposes
原
and
则
principles of the UN
都应得
Charter
到遵
should
守。
be upheld.
各国
that
合
the
理安全
legitimate
关切
security
都
concerns
应
of
得
all
到重
countries
视，
should be taken
一
seriously,
切有利于
and that
和
all
平解决
efforts
危机的
conducive
努
to a
力
peaceful
都
settlement
应
of the
得到
crisis should
支
be
持。
supported.
推动早
Putting
日
an
停火
early
止
end
战
to the
是国
fight
际社会的
is the
迫切
urgent
期待，
expectation of the
也是中
international
方的
community.
努力
It
方
is
向。
also what China is
中
striving
方
for.
支持一切
China
有利于
supports all
缓解乌克
initiatives
兰人
and
道危
measures
机的倡
that
议
will help
和
ease
举
the
措，
humanitarian crisis
呼
in
吁当
Ukraine.
事方
We call on
尊
the
重
parties
国际人
concerned
道
to
法，
respect
采
international
取切实
humanitarian
行动
law and
保
take
护
concrete
平民安
actions to
全，
ensure the safety of
保障
civilians
妇女、
and
儿
protect the
童
basic
等
rights
弱
and
势群体
humanitarian
的
needs
基
of
本
women,
权利
children, and
和
other
人道
vulnerable
需求。
groups.
有关不
The
掐镇
reports
平
and
民死亡
images
的
of
报道和
civilian
画
deaths
面
in Bucha
令人不安。
are disturbing.
事件的
The
相关
relevant
情况和具体
circumstances
原
and
因
specific
必须
causes
查
of
清，
incident must be
任
verified
何指
and
控
established.
都应基
Any
于事
accusations
实。
should be based on
结
facts.
论得出之前，
Before a full
各
picture
方
is
应
clear,
保
all
持
sides
克
should
制，
exercise
避
restraint
免无
and
端指
avoid
责。
unfounded accusations.
主席先生，
Mr. President,
对话谈判
dialogue and
是解决乌克兰
negotiation
危
is
机
the
的
only
唯一
way
出
out
路
of。the Ukraine crisis.
中方始终
China
主张
always
国际
believes
社
that
会
the
应该
international
保持理
community
性
should，remain
加强
rational,
团结，
strengthen unity,
多做有
and
利
do
于对
more
话
to
谈判的
facilitate
事，
dialogue and
推动政
negotiation
治解决，
and political
而不
settlement.
应设
It
置
should
障
not
碍，
set up obstacles
增添阻
or
力，
add
更不
resistance,
应
let
火
alone
上浇
adding
油，
fuel
激
to the
化矛
fire
盾。
to aggravate
我
confrontations.
们遗憾地看
We
到，
regret to see
冲突
that the
造
conflict
成
has
平民
caused
伤亡
civilian
和大
casualties
量人
and
员
massive
流离
displacement.
失所。全方位、
And the
无差别、
all-dimensional
无底线
indiscriminate
的制
sanctions
裁，
without a bottom line
给疫
have
后复
brought
苏带来
serious
严
negative
重负面
impact
影响，
on the post-pandemic
制造出
recovery,
新的
creating new and
复杂
complex
问题，
problems,
逆转来之不易的
reversing
发展
hard-won
成果，
development gains,
实现
and making the
2030年可持
realization
续
of
发
the
展议程
2030 agenda
雪
even
上
more
加霜。
difficult.
各国，尤其
People
是
around
发
the
展中
world,
国家民
especially
众，
those in
不
developing
得不
countries,
承
have to
受
bear the
飞涨的
soaring
物价、
oil and food prices.
油价、粮价等等。疫情之下的
Life
生
amid
活
the pandemic
更加
has
艰难，
become even more difficult,
妇女、
and the
儿
rights
童
of
的权
women
益
and children
更难得到
even
保
more
障。
difficult to be protected.
发展中国家
Developing
不是
countries
冲突
are
当事
not
方，
parties to the conflict,
却被卷
yet
入
they are
地缘政
forced
治
to
竞
get
争
involved
和
in
大
this
国博弈，
geopolitical competition
这
and
是不
great
公
power
平的。
rivalry. This is unfair.
个别国家
Some
一
individual
边
countries,
声
while
称主
talking
张和平，
loudly about peace,
一边
are
热
bent
衷
or
制造
obsessed
集团
with
对抗，
creating bloc
包括
confrontations,
在
including
亚太地区
provoking
挑起
tensions
紧
in
张
the
局势。
Asia-Pacific region.
这种
This
自相矛盾、
self-conflicting
言
and
行不一的
self-serving
做法
practice
非常
is
危险，
very dangerous
令人
and
担忧，
worrying
应该
and should be
坚决抵制。
resolutely rejected.
中方一贯主张在平等和相互尊重基础上，
promoting human rights
通过
through
建设性
constructive
对话
dialogue
与合作，
and cooperation
促
on
进
the
和
basis
保
of
障人权。
equality and mutual respect.
同时，
At the same time,
我们坚
we
决反
firmly
对将
oppose
人
the
权问题政
politicization
治化、
or
工具化，
instrumentalization of human
反
rights
对在人
issues,
权问题上
oppose the
搞
selective
选择
and
性、
confrontational
双重
approaches,
标准
as well as
和
double
对抗
standards
做法，
on human rights
反对
issues,
借
and
人权
oppose
问题
exerting
对别
pressure
国施
onto
压。
other countries in the name of
这
human
也是
rights.
关于设立
Those
人
are
权理事
also
会的联大
important
第
elements
60251
contained in
号
General
决议
Assembly
的
Resolution
重要内容。
60/25, which set up this human rights
摆
council.
在我们面前的这份决议
The
草案
draft resolution before us
将剥夺
will
一国
deprive
在
a
人权理
country's
事会的
legitimate membership
合
of the
法
Human
会员
Rights
资格
Council.
对如此
Such an
重大的
important
事项，
matter
必须
must
极
be
为慎
handled
重，
with the
基
utmost
于事实和
delicacy,
真理，冷
based
静、
on
客观、
facts,
理性
with
的
calmness,
处理。
objectivity, and reason based on facts and truth.
然而，
Nevertheless,
这份决议草
this
案
draft
起草过
resolution
程
was not
不公
drafted
开，
in an open
不透明，
and transparent manner.
也没有
Nor
按
did
照
they
惯例
follow
举
the
行全体
tradition
会
of
员国
holding
磋商，
consultations with the
广
entire
泛听取
membership
意见。
to heed the broadest
在此
opinions.
情况下，
Under these
急
circumstances,
于在联
such
大
a
采取
hasty
行动，
move at the General
逼迫
Assembly,
各国
which forces
选边
countries
站
to
队，
choose sides,
将加
will
剧会员国
aggravate
分裂，
the division
激化
among
当事
division
方矛盾，
among member states,
火
and
上浇油，
intensify the
不
confrontation
利于
between the
冲
parties
突的
concerned.
降
It
级，
is
更不利于推进
like
和平
adding
谈判。
fuel to the fire, which is not
用
conducive
这
to
样的
the
方式处
escalation
理
of
人权
conflicts
理
and
事会
even
成
less
员
so
资格
to
问题，
advance in the peace talks.
将创造
Dealing with the
新的
membership
危
of
险
Human
先例
Rights， Council is
进一
such a
步
way
加剧人
will
权领域
set
的对
new
抗，
dangerous precedent,
对
further
联合国
intensify
治理体系
confrontation in the field of
产
human
生
rights,
更大冲击，
bringing a greater impact
造
on
成
the UN
严重
governance
后果。
system and produce
基于
serious
上述，
consequences. Therefore,
中方将对
China
决议草案投
will
反对票。
have to vote against this draft
中方
resolution.
呼吁各方
China
相
calls
向
on
而
all
行，
parties to work
共
together
同努力，
in the same direction
为
so
和
as to
平
create
创造机
opportunities
会，
for peace
为
and
谈判
prospects
开
for
辟前景。
negotiation.
中方将继
China
续
will
本着客
continue
观公正的
to
立场，
hold an objective
为
and
此发
impartial
挥
position
负责
and
任、
play its
建设性的作
responsible
用。
and constructive
谢
role
谢你，
in this
主席
regard.
先生。
Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of China. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mexico.
Señor presidente, México ha sido claro y
President,
contundente
Mexico has
al
been
condenar la invasión de
clear and
Rusia sobre
categorical in
Ucrania
condemning
por ser violatoria del derecho
invasion by
internacional,
Russia
de la
against
Carta de las
Ukraine,
Naciones
since it
Unidas
violates
y de los
international law,
principios
the Charter of the
constitucionales de
United
nuestra
Nations,
política
and the
exterior.
constitutional principles of our
También hemos
foreign
condenado
policy.
los ataques
We have
contra la
also
población
condemned
civil
attacks
y
against
su
the
infraestructura.
civilian population and its
Hemos impulsado
infrastructure.
todo aquello que
We have
facilite el
promoted
acceso a la
everything which
asistencia
facilitates
humanitaria
access to
y nos hemos
humanitarian
sumado a las
assistance,
voces que
and we
exigen
have
el cese
joined those
inmediato de
voices
las
which call for the
hostilidades.
immediate cessation of
Informes
hostilities.
recientes sobre la situación en
Recent
Ucrania
reports about the
nos han
situation
revelado
in
que
Ukraine
estamos ante la probable
show us
comisión
that
de
we
violaciones
are
graves del
facing
derecho
a probable
internacional de los
commission of
derechos humanos
serious
y del
violations of
derecho internacional
international law
humanitario.
and
Por ello,
the
México
international
ha
law of human
respaldado
rights and
sin
of
ambajes
humanitarian
el
international
llamado
law.
del secretario
Mexico
general
has thus
a que se realicen
clearly backed
investigaciones
the Secretary General's
imparciales
call
que permitan
to
identificar
conduct impartial
responsables y
investigations
una
which
eficaz
may allow
rendición de cuentas.
identifying those
Mi país
responsible
también
and
apoyó la
have
adopción de
effective
la resolución
accountability. My
49
country also
diagonal
supported the
1 del
adoption of
Consejo de
Resolution
Derechos Humanos
49/1 of the
para
Human
que se
Rights
formara
Council
una
to
comisión de
establish
investigación
an
independiente
independent
con el
commission
objetivo
of
de indagar
inquiry
todos los
in order
presuntos abusos
to
y violaciones de los derechos humanos y
investigate
todo
all of
aquello que
the
pudiese
alleged
vulnerar
abuses and
el
violations
derecho
of human rights
internacional
and anything
humanitario
which could
derivado de
violate
la agresión
humanitarian
de
international
Rusia
law
en Ucrania.
flowing from
Asimismo,
Russia's
México
aggression
sigue con
against
atención
Ukraine.
el proceso de
Mexico
investigación de
also
la Corte
follows
Penal
attentively the
Internacional
process of
por presuntos crímenes
inquiry of the
internacionales
International
cometidos
Criminal
en
Court
Ucrania y
of
apoya
alleged
decididamente los
international crimes
trabajos que
committed in
realiza el fiscal
Ukraine
de la
and
Corte
clearly
para tratar
supports
de
the work
esclarecer
done by
los
the
hechos.
prosecutor to
Estamos
establish
atentos
and
al desarrollo del caso
clarify the facts.
presentado ante la Corte
We are
Internacional de
following the development
Justicia
of the case brought
y
before the
reiteramos su
International Court of
llamado a
Justice,
cumplir
and we
con la
reiterate
reciente
its call
orden
to
de medidas
comply with the
provisionales
recent
para un cese inmediato
provisional
de las
measures
hostilidades.
for
Se trata,
an immediate
pues,
cessation
de
of
procesos
hostilities.
judiciales y
These
casi
are
judiciales
judicial and
que están en curso,
quasi-judicial
pero que
processes
todavía
which are
no han
underway,
calificado
but which have
jurídicamente
not
las
yet,
situaciones
in
que
legal
tienen
terms,
bajo examen.
classified these
Debemos
situations under
ser
consideration.
consistentes,
We must be consistent.
apoyarlos hasta sus últimas
We must
consecuencias
support
y
them
examinar
until
con
they reach
rigor
their
sus
ultimate,
conclusiones.
conclusions and
La
examine
permanencia
them
o no de
rigorously.
Rusia en el Consejo de
Whether
Derechos
Russia
Humanos
is a member
no
of the Human
constituye
Rights
un
Council
factor
or
que
not
la exima
is
o
not
que
a
le imponga
factor which
obligaciones
exempts it
bajo el derecho
from
internacional.
obligations under
El
international
punto
law or
central
which imposes
debe ser llevar ante la justicia
The
a
central
quienes
point here
resulten
should be to bring to
responsables,
justice those
no suspender a un
responsible,
Estado de su
not to
pertenencia
suspend
a un órgano
state
subsidiario
from
de esta
membership
Asamblea,
in a subsidiary
ante el
body
cual
of this assembly,
todos los Estados
in which
miembros,
all
sin
member
excepción,
states, without
debemos rendir
exception,
cuentas
must be
bajo las mismas
accountable
reglas
under the
y
same
conforme
rules
a los
and
mismos
the
criterios.
same criteria.
México está a favor de que la rendición de
Mexico
cuentas se
is in
practique
favor
regularmente en todo el
of
sistema de las Naciones
accountability
Unidas.
being regularly
Necesitamos
practiced
más
throughout the
transparencia,
United
sí,
Nations system. We
pero
do
para
need
ello
more
necesitamos
transparency,
también
but
más
to that end,
cooperación,
we also need
más
more
diálogo
cooperation,
y mejores
more
prácticas.
dialogue, and better practices.
Las estructuras multilaterales se
Multilateral
fortalecen
structures
mediante
are
la
strengthened
inclusión,
through
no
inclusion,
a través
not
la
through
exclusión.
exclusion.
Excluir, suspender, no es la solución.
To suspend
El
is not
multilateralismo
the
habrá de
solution.
fortalecerse en la
Multilateralism
medida
will
en
be
la que sea
strengthened
capaz de
to the
mantener
extent
su
that it
vocación
is able to
incluyente.
maintain
Las
its
resoluciones previas de esta asamblea que
inclusiveness.
hemos suscrito con
prior
plena
resolutions
convicción
of this assembly, which we have
condenan la
supported
invasión rusa,
with conviction,
llaman a un cese
condemn the
inequívoco de
Russian
las
invasion,
hostilidades,
call for a clear
urgen el
cessation
acceso
of
irrestricto de
hostilities,
la asistencia
urge
humanitaria
the
y
unrestricted
abogan por
access
una
to
solución
humanitarian
diplomática
assistance,
del conflicto.
and advocate for a diplomatic
México
solution to the conflict.
ha fijado su posición de
Mexico
manera
has stated
explícita
its position
en torno a la agresión
explicitly
militar de Rusia
with
sobre
regard
Ucrania
to
a través de
Russia's
sus
military aggression
intervenciones
against
en el
Ukraine
Consejo de Seguridad
through its
y en
statements in the
esta
Security
Asamblea
Council
General,
and in this
así
General
como en los
Assembly,
votos
as well as
registrados
in the
en
votes
ambos órganos
taken in both
desde el
bodies
inicio del conflicto.
since the beginning of the conflict.
Por lo anteriormente expuesto,
In view
México
of the
se
above,
abstendrá de apoyar el
Mexico will
proyecto de
abstain
resolución
from
que
supporting
suspende a
the draft
Rusia de sus
resolution
derechos
which
como
suspends
integrantes del Consejo de Derechos
Russia from
Humanos.
membership in
México
the
tiene
Human
la
Rights
convicción
Council.
de
Mexico
que
is
aún en medio de la
convinced
guerra
that
deben
even in the
mantenerse
midst of the
todos los
war,
canales de diálogo
all
con las autoridades de la Federación de
channels
Rusia,
should
no
be
solo para
maintained
que
for
cooperen
dialogue with
con
the
el
authorities
conjunto
of
de
the Russian
mecanismos que
Federation,
integran el
not only
Sistema
so that
Universal
they
de Protección
cooperate with
de los
all
Derechos
the
Humanos,
mechanisms which are part
sino
of
para
the
insistir
universal system
en
of
la
protection
urgente
of human
necesidad de
rights, but
encontrar
also
en
to
el
insist
diálogo
on the urgent
la
need
solución
to
diplomática
find
que
in
restaure la
dialogue
paz en Ucrania.
the
Muchas
diplomatic
gracias, presidente.
solution which restores peace in Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Mexico. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Chile.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Permítame iniciar mi
Allow
intervención
me to start my
rendiendo homenaje a
intervention
las víctimas de la
by
brutal
paying
guerra que
tribute
está
to
teniendo
the
lugar en
brutal
Ucrania,
war that is taking place in
ocasionada por una
Ukraine,
invasión que ha violado normas del derecho
caused
internacional,
by
del derecho
an
internacional
aggression that
humanitario y
violated
la Carta de
international law,
Naciones Unidas.
international humanitarian law, and the
Las
UN Charter.
dramáticas imágenes de Bucha que
The
llegaron a
tragic
nuestros
images
hogares
of
el pasado fin de
Bucha
semana
that
nos han conmovido.
came to our
Chile reitera una vez más
homes
su condena a la
last
invasión a
week
Ucrania.
moved us
La
tremendously.
decisión que
We
hoy se
condemn the
adoptará
invasion
es
of
una a la que
Ukraine.
mi país nunca
The
hubiera querido llegar.
decision that
Un país
we
firme
are discussing
partidario del
is a decision that
multilateralismo
my country would have
sostiene que
never
las diferencias
wanted
entre
to
Estados deben
discuss.
resolverse
We are
dentro de los
fully in
órganos
favor of
competentes
multilateralism.
de acuerdo a las normas vigentes. El sistema multilateral
The
es
multilateral
la casa de
system
todos.
is a home for
Sin embargo, el
everyone.
ser miembro del Consejo de
However,
Derechos
to
Humanos
be a
reviste
member
una
of the Human
exigencia
Rights Council
particular en cuanto a un compromiso y
involves
conducta
certain
coherentes
requirements,
y
including
promoción y respeto a los derechos humanos en todo
conduct
momento y en todo
consistent
lugar.
with the promotion and
Así lo
protection of
hicieron
human
los
rights
Estados miembros de
everywhere.
esta Asamblea General
As
al aprobar la resolución
member states of this assembly
60/251 en su
adopted
párrafo 9 que dispone
a
que los miembros
relevant
elegidos al
resolution
Consejo
which
deberán
states
aplicar las
that
normas
the
más
members
estrictas
of
en la
the
promoción y
security of the
protección de
Human
los
Rights
derechos
Council
humanos.
must follow the strict standards
Esa misma
of promotion
resolución
and
en el
protection of
párrafo
human rights.
8
That same
le
resolution
encarga a
in
esta
paragraph
Asamblea la
8
responsabilidad de
entrusts to this assembly
suspender a un
the
Estado miembro
responsibility
del
of
Consejo
suspending a
cuando
member
éste
state
no
from the
cumpla con
council
dichas
when that
normas
state does not
estrictas
comply with these
en la
strict
promoción y
norms
protección
of
de los derechos
protecting
humanos.
and promoting human
Nuestra
rights.
responsabilidad con los derechos
Our
humanos, no con un
responsibility to
determinado
human
país, no
rights,
con Rusia,
rather
no
than
con
a
Ucrania, con
specific
los derechos
country or
humanos.
Russia or
En
Ukraine.
el caso de
Our
hoy, la suspensión
responsibilities
de la
to
membresía de
human
la
rights
Federación Rusa
and
del Consejo de Derechos
the
Humanos
suspension of the Russian
revestirá
Federation
la
from the Human Rights
agravante de
Council.
que se trata de un Estado responsable de violarlos en el territorio
In this
soberano
case, we're
de un
talking
tercer
about a
Estado,
state that is
en este caso
violating the rights
Ucrania,
of
fruto de
a
un
third
acto de
state,
agresión y
Ukraine. And
ocupación
this is a result
inaceptable
of
desde
an
cualquier
unacceptable
ángulo del derecho
aggression and
internacional.
invasion that is
Es por ello que nuestra
contravenes
delegación votará a
international law.
favor
This
del
is why
proyecto de
our
resolución
delegation will vote in favor of the resolution
A/11/L.4 que suspende la
L.4,
membresía
which
de Rusia
suspends the
del
membership
Consejo
of
de
Russia
Derechos
in
Humanos.
the Human Rights Council.
Chile reitera nuevamente su
Chile once again
llamado a
reiterates
todas las
its
partes para
appeal
que
to
continúen
all
las
parties to
conversaciones
continue
e insta de nuevo a la resolución pacífica
negotiations
inmediata
and
del conflicto entre
urges
la
for an
Federación Rusa
immediate
y Ucrania
peaceful
mediante
resolution
el
of the
diálogo
conflict between
político,
Russia and
las
Ukraine through
negociaciones, la mediación
political
y otros
dialogue,
medios pacíficos
negotiations,
de
through peaceful
conformidad con el
means
derecho
in
internacional.
conformity with international
Muchas
law.
gracias, señor
Thank you
presidente.
very much, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Chile. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belarus.
Господин председатель,
Mr. President,
Беларусь выступает
Belarus
категорически
is
против
categorically against
представленного проекта
the draft
резолюции.
resolution under
Выдвижение
consideration.
проекта мотивировано исключительно
introduction of
политическими
this
интересами,
draft is motivated
имеющими
by
цель
exclusively
демонизации
political
Российской
interests
Федерации
aimed
и
at
попытку ее
demonizing the Russian
изоляции
Federation
в
and attempting
международных
to isolate
организациях.
it in international organizations.
Такие идеи ведут
Such
к
ideas lead to
разбалансировке
upsetting the
всей системы
equilibrium of the
международного
entire
сотрудничества,
system of
которая основана
international
на Уставе
cooperation, which is based
Организации
on the
Объединенных
UN
Наций,
Charter.
и к долгосрочным негативным последствиям
Could have
вплоть до
long-term
развала
negative
самой
impact,
организации,
even
самой
leading
ООН.
to the destruction of the UN as a
По
whole.
сути, сегодняшнее предложение
essence,
об исключении
today's
России
proposal
есть
to
прямой
exclude Russia
вклад
is a
в уничтожение и самого Совета по
contribution
правам
to
человека,
destroying
и в
the
закрепление
Human
развала
Rights
системы
Council itself,
соблюдения
and
прав
in
человека под
consolidating the
эгидой ООН,
destruction of the
который уже выражается,
system of
особенно
upholding
в
human
последние
rights under the
несколько
UN
недель,
auspices, which has been expressed over the past few weeks
настроений
by
расизма, ксенофобии, других
attitudes of racism,
проявлений
xenophobia, and
дискриминации
other
по
manifestations
языковой,
of discrimination
культурной,
based on language,
религиозной
culture,
и
religion,
иной
or other
принадлежности
characteristics
в
that
западных
we're seeing
странах.
in Western countries.
Необходимо заниматься не
It's
решением
important
сиюминутных
to focus
задач
not
под
on
влиянием эмоций,
short-term
а
immediate
думать, среди
tasks
прочего, о
under the
перспективах
influence of emotions,
урегулирования
but rather
конфликтных
to
ситуаций
think about the
и
long-term
постконфликтного
prospects of resolving
мироустройства.
conflict situations and
Предлагаемое
the
решение, как и
post-conflict world
другие
order.
аналогичные
The
шаги,
resolution that
попытки
is being
ограничения
proposed,
участия
just like
России
other
в
steps
международных
on
организациях, не
restricting
только
the
не
participation of Russia
внесут
in
вклад в
international
урегулирование
organizations, will
ситуации
not
на
only
Украине,
not make a
но
contribution to
скорее
resolving the
подвергнут
situation in Ukraine, but
дополнительному
rather
риску
will
перспективы мирного
increase
переговорного
risks
процесса,
for any
у истоков
possibility of
которого,
peaceful
хочу
negotiations,
напомнить,
which were initiated, I just
месяц
want to
назад
recall,
стояла
a
и
month ago
Республика Беларусь, и
by
лично
the
ее
Republic
президент
of
Александр
Belarus
Лукашенко.
and personally
Мы
its president,
призываем
Alexander
задуматься
Lukashenko.
об этом
So
и
we call
проголосовать
on you to think
против
about, to reflect on this, and to
представленного
vote
проекта
against
резолюции.
the
Благодарю вас за внимание.
proposed draft resolution. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Belarus. We have heard the last speaker in explanation of vote before the vote. The Assembly will now take a decision on a draft resolution A/ES-11/L4 entitled Suspension of the Rights of the Membership of the Russian Federation in the Human Rights Council. Pursuant to Resolution 60/251 of 15 March 2006, the General Assembly, by a 2/3 majority of members present and voting, may suspend the rights of membership in the Council of a member of the Council that commits gross and systematic violation of human rights. For your information, the draft resolution has closed for e-sponsorship. I now give the floor to the representative of the Secretariat.
Thank you, Mr. President. I should like to announce that since the submission of the draft resolution, and in addition to the delegations listed on the L document, the following countries have also become co-sponsors of A/ES-11/L4: Costa Rica, Guatemala, Myanmar, and San Marino. If any other countries wish to co-sponsor A/ES-11/L4, please signify by pressing the microphone button now. I see none. I thank you. Sorry, Tonga. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Secretariat. A recorded vote has been requested. We shall now begin the voting process. Those in favor of draft resolution A/ES-11/L4, please signify. Those against, abstentions.
The General Assembly is now voting on draft resolution A/ES-11/L4, entitled Suspension of the Rights of Membership of the Russian Federation in the Human Rights Council. Will all delegations confirm that their votes are accurately reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
The result of the vote is as follows. In favor, 93, against, 24, abstentions, 58. Draft resolution A/ES-11/L4 is adopted. Before giving the floor for explanations of vote after the vote, may I remind delegations that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. India has abstained on the resolution adopted in the General Assembly today. We do so for reasons of both substance and process. Since the inception of the Ukrainian conflict, India has stood for peace, dialogue, and diplomacy. We believe that no solution can be arrived at by shedding blood and at the cost of innocent lives. If India has chosen any side, it is the side of peace, and it is for an immediate end to violence. We continue to remain deeply concerned at the worsening situation and reiterate our call for end to all hostilities. When innocent human lives are at stake, diplomacy must prevail as the only viable option. Recent reports of civilian killings in Bucha are deeply disturbing. We have unequivocally condemned these killings and support the call for an independent investigation. The impact of the crisis has also been felt beyond the region with increasing food and energy costs, especially for many developing countries. It is in our collective interest to work constructively, both inside the United Nations and outside, towards seeking an early resolution to the conflict. India has been at the forefront of protecting human rights, right from the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We firmly believe that all decisions should be taken fully respecting due process, as all our democratic polity and structures enjoin us to do so. This applies to international organizations as well, particularly the United Nations. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of India. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Timor-Leste.
At the outset, I would like to thank you, Mr. President, for convening this session. Mr. President, the position we took today to vote in favor of this resolution before all of us is a manifestation of our strong solidarity with the people of Ukraine, especially the victims of this war who have been forced to shelter and have fled across the country's borders, as well as those who have lost their homes, their lives, their family members, and their own lives. Our thoughts and prayers go out to all of them and their families and friends. Mr. President, our vote today shows our clear position to uphold human rights values in all circumstances and in all cases, as the dark period of our own history has taught us enough on the high cost of being victims of war. We call for an effective ceasefire in Ukraine and urge conflict parties to continue the dialogue and negotiation to stop this war and avoid further potentially catastrophic escalation. We commend the efforts of those who have facilitated the peace talks between conflict parties and all for more diplomatic initiatives to help in finding a peaceful solution for all. All parties must ensure the safety and protection of all civilians. It is our hope that peace is reclaimed immediately and that the important work for a healthy, prosperous, and sustainable future is restored for all. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Timor-Leste. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Qatar.
شكرا لكم السيد الرئيس. صوت وفد بلادي بالامتناع على مشروع القرار الذي اعتمد للتو في هذه الجلسة الاستثنائية الطارئة للجمعية العامة، وأود أن أدلي بالتالي لتوضيح موقف دولة قطر. سيد الرئيس، لقد أعربت دولة قطر عن موقفها تجاه الحالة في أوكرانيا المستند إلى التزامها الثابت بالمبادئ الراسخة للقانون الدولي وميثاق الأمم المتحدة، بما في ذلك عدم جواز استخدام القوة أو التهديد باستخدامها في العلاقات الدولية وتسوية المنازعات الدولية بالوسائل السلمية وعدم التدخل في الشؤون الداخلية للدول والالتزام بسيادة الدول واستقلالها وسلامتها الإقليمية. وقد شددت دولة قطر مرارا على أن ضمان سلامة المدنيين يجب أن يحظى بأولوية قصوى، كما نؤكد على ضرورة الالتزام بالقانون الإنساني الدولي وحماية المرافق والبنى التحتية المدنية والمدنيين العاملين في المجال الطبي والإنساني والصحفيين، وكذلك تيسير إجلاء المدنيين والوصول الآمن والسريع للمساعدات الإنسانية إلى المحتاجين وفق المبادئ الدولية لإيصال المساعدة الإنسانية. وتثني دولة قطر على الجهود الحثيثة التي تبذلها الأمم المتحدة والمنظمات الإنسانية للاستجابة للاحتياجات الإنسانية الطارئة وجهود الدول المضيفة للاجئين. دولة قطر على تواصل مع الشركاء الدوليين بتقييم الوضع الإنساني وتقديم المساعدات اللازمة للشعب الأوكراني. سيد الرئيس، نؤكد على دعوة الأمين العام للأمم المتحدة للعودة إلى طريق الحوار والمفاوضات والتوصل إلى وقف إطلاق نار فوري للأعراض الإنسانية. كما نجدد دعوة دولة قطر لجميع الأطراف إلى ضبط النفس وحل الخلاف عبر الحوار والطرق الدبلوماسية وتسوية المنازعات الدولية بالوسائل السلمية وعدم اتخاذ ما من شأنه أن يؤدي إلى المزيد من التصعيد. وسوف تستمر دولة قطر في تسخير جهودها الدبلوماسية للمساعدة على الوصول إلى حل الأزمة وفقا لميثاق الأمم المتحدة والقانون الدولي. كما ترحب دولة قطر بوساطة الجمهورية التركية بين روسيا وأوكرانيا وتأمل في أن تفضي هذه المفاوضات بالتوصل إلى اتفاق سلام شامل ودائم بين البلدين. وشكرا لكم السيد الرئيس.
into a peace accord between both countries. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Qatar. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Laos People's Democratic Republic.
Mr. President, the Lao PDR once again reiterates its call for peaceful political and diplomatic solution to the conflict and supports all ongoing efforts and peace negotiations between the parties concerned. Likewise, we urge the international community to refrain from any action that could fuel escalation of tension. As party to 7 of the 9 core human rights treaties, Lao PDR opposes all gross and systematic violations and abuses of human rights. We are gravely concerned by the recent reports and accusations of human rights and international human rights law violations and abuses. We are of the view that such serious allegation must not be taken lightly and must be backed up by solid evidence and verified by an independent investigation mechanism of the United Nations, especially the Human Rights Council Independent International Committee inquiries. My delegation voted against the draft resolution L4 because we believe that the reports of violations and abuses of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law must be verified by credible, neutral, impartial, an independent assessment mechanism before any action is taken. Laupedia is concerned by the notion that any of member states of the UN Human Rights Council can be subject to suspension and other punitive measures without due process of investigation and verification. As this issue is of paramount importance for all United Nations members, we also believe that all GA resolutions should be adopted by consensus, reflecting the spirit of equality, solidarity among UN member states. In conclusion, my delegation believes there is a dire need for more clarification through an independent mechanism that should be accepted and supported by all member states before drawing conclusion and passing judgment. We remain hopeful that the most urgent task now is to create the environment conducive for a peaceful resolution to the conflict and immediate ceasefire agreement, which will eventually lead to total cessation of hostilities. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Laos People's Democratic Republic. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Indonesia.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is distressing to see the hostilities in Ukraine persist and the number of civilians and casualties continue to rise. We share the international community's deep concern regarding the devastating human rights and humanitarian situation in Ukraine. And we do not take lightly reports of gross and systemic violations and abuse of human rights, including recent reports from Bucha. For these reasons, we believe the Human Rights Council must remain seized on the matter and supports the Secretary General's call for a thorough and independent investigation. We also fully support the establishment of an independent international commission of inquiry by the Human Rights Council. Mr. President, there is no question that those responsible for violations and abuse of human rights in Ukraine must be held accountable and brought to justice. The Commission, therefore, must receive full support and access needed to effectively carry out its mandate. In the meantime, we have to give a chance for the Commission to work in an objective and transparent manner and present its findings and reports. We must allow due diligence and not prejudge the work of the Commission. The General Assembly must also be prudent. It is important to have received all the facts before taking action that revokes legitimate rights of its members. Moreover, the General Assembly's action must not create negative precedents that can undermine the credibility of this august body. It is for these reasons Indonesia abstained on Resolution L4. Mr. President, Indonesia remains steadfast in our commitment to respect and protect human rights for all. Our priority now must be to save lives and protect civilians in Ukraine. We reaffirm our call to all parties to stop the hostilities and to spare no efforts to achieve peace through dialogue and diplomacy. This is the only way we can end the suffering and senseless loss of lives in Ukraine and to prevent the increasing negative impact of the war beyond the region. So we must stop the war, and I repeat, we must stop the war now, otherwise we will all suffer. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Indonesia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Panama.
Panamá ha decidido votar a favor de la resolución suspensión de los derechos de la membresía de la Federación Rusia en el Consejo de Derechos Humanos, en virtud de su apoyo a los principios y propósitos de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas y al pilar de los derechos humanos, y en especial porque los Estados miembros deben cumplir con sus compromisos en la esfera de los derechos humanos al ser electos ante este principal órgano de las Naciones Unidas. Panamá, fiel de su vocación multilateralista y y
Panama is
defensora de los
faithful
derechos
to
humanos,
multilateralism and the
apoya la
defense of human
participación de los
rights
Estados
and
miembros
supports the
en los órganos
participation of member
internacionales.
states in
Por
international
eso, en
bodies.
términos generales, no
Thus,
apoyamos
in
la
general
separación
terms,
de
we
un
do
miembro
not
de la
support
membresía de los foros
separating a
multilaterales.
member state from membership
Esta
in
decisión es
multilateral
tomada
fora.
en un
This
contexto de
decision is
gravedad
taken
notorio,
in a context
ante
of
las
flagrant
evidentes violaciones
gravity,
graves y
given
sistemáticas de
gross and
derechos humanos
systematic violations
contra
of
civiles
human
en
rights
Ucrania.
against civilians
Panamá,
in Ukraine.
preocupada por la grave
Panama,
situación, se
concerned over
encuentra
the
frente al
serious
imperativo de
situation,
apoyar esta
finds
iniciativa
itself
que ha
faced
llevado a
with
la
the
Asamblea
imperative of
General de las
supporting
Naciones
this
Unidas
initiative,
a considerar
which
la
has taken
suspensión
the General
temporal
Assembly of the
de un
UN to
Estado
consider the
miembro de
temporary
este órgano
suspension of
principal
a
de
member
derechos
state of
humanos.
this principal
Señor
human rights
presidente,
body.
este escenario ya lo vivimos
Mr.
en el
President,
año 2011,
we already lived
cuando un
through
Estado,
this in
Libia, fue suspendido del
2011
Consejo de
when
Derechos
a
Humanos
state,
por un
Libya, was
periodo de
suspended
8
from the
meses.
Human Rights Council
Panamá en su
for a
momento
period
apoyó
of
esta
8
iniciativa
months.
temporal
Panama at
y
that time
posteriormente
supported this
copatrocinó la
temporary
resolución
initiative and
que permitió su
co-sponsored the
admisión.
resolution which
Panamá
permitted
emite hoy
its
su
admission.
voto en espera que la decisión
Panama
sea de
votes
carácter
today
temporal,
hoping that the decision
priorizando que los
will be
Estados miembros
temporary,
mantengan su apego
prioritizing that
a los
member states
principios
will
de respeto
support
de los más altos
principles for
estándares
respect
de derechos
for
humanos.
the highest
Por ello,
human rights
destacamos la
standards.
necesidad de garantizar
We
la
therefore highlight the
universalidad
need to
en el examen
guarantee
de las cuestiones de
universality in
derechos humanos,
considering human rights
incluyendo la
issues,
aplicación del
including the
párrafo 8 de
application
la
of
resolución
paragraph 8 of
60/251
Resolution
para evitar señales
60/251
contradictorias al
to
evaluar los casos de
avoid
violaciones de
contradictions
derechos
in
humanos.
evaluating
Señor presidente,
cases of human rights
quiero terminar la
violations.
intervención de mi
Mr.
país
President, I
exhortando
conclude by
nuevamente
appealing
llamado al diálogo y a la
once
diplomacia
again
para
our
una
call to
resolución
dialogue and
pacífica del
diplomacy
conflicto.
toward a peaceful
Estamos
settlement of the
plenamente
conflict. We
convencidos
are fully
de que será a
convinced
través del
that it will be
diálogo
through
y el
dialogue
entendimiento
and
que este
understanding
devastador
that this
conflicto llegará a
devastating
su fin
conflict
y
will
regresaremos
end,
al camino de
and
la
we
paz
will
y la
return to the
solidaridad.
path of
Gracias, señor
peace and
presidente.
solidarity. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Panama. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Thailand.
Mr. President, Thailand voted to abstain on the resolution because of the overriding importance that we attach to a transparent, impartial, and inclusive approach in the multilateral regime. A decision to suspend the membership of a member state in any United Nations body cannot be taken lightly. The process must be done through careful consultations based on principles, verified facts, and taking into account constructive opinions as well as foreseeable consequences. We express our deepest condolences to the people of Ukraine and the bereaved families who lost their loved ones from the ongoing war in Ukraine. We are deeply concerned with the escalation of conflicts and humanitarian crises in Ukraine, while believing that prompt action must be taken in response to all alleged human rights atrocities against civilians, including in Bucha. We are of the view that any action taken should be impartial, transparent, and comprehensive. To objectively consider the situations, it would require well-rounded established facts and additional concrete evidence proven by reliable sources, including those presented to international courts. We thus support the United Nations Secretary General's call for an independent investigation to ensure accountability and hope that the Independent International Commission of Inquiry established by the Human Rights Council would be able to commence its work soonest to investigate the serious allegations in an impartial, transparent, and comprehensive manner. We strongly urge all parties to fully comply with international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and to protect civilians and civilian objects, as well as ensure unhindered provision of humanitarian assistance without discrimination. Another life lost is another life too many. On our part, Thailand continues to provide humanitarian assistance to support those suffering from the conflict in Ukraine. In line with the HRC's principles of non-selectivity and constructive dialogue, we reiterate our strong support of the continuation of political dialogues as the only way to end a humanitarian crisis is to end the dispute. Thus, Thailand once again calls for utmost efforts by all parties and the international community to cease and desist the aggravation of fighting and continue our maximum endeavor on ending the conflict. Thailand reiterates our call for a continuation of political dialogues between the concerned parties to find peaceful and sustainable solutions. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Thailand. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Vietnam.
Mr. President, Vietnam has maintained a principled and steadfast position in support of resolving conflicts by peaceful means and with respect for the United Nations Charter, international law, including the principles of sovereign equality, respect for independence and territorial integrity of states, and refrainment from the threat or use of force. We have followed closely with great concerns over the situation in Ukraine, with severe consequences for the people. It is with extreme concern that we learn of recent reports of great loss of life among innocent civilians. Vietnam opposes and condemns all forms of attacks against civilians in violation of international law, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law. Recent information in this regard should be examined based on objective and transparent verification with the cooperation of parties concerned. We have time and again reiterated that it is imperative to immediately cease the use of force to avoid further civilian casualties and losses, as well as damages to civilian infrastructure. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine, if not resolved peacefully and expeditiously, will continue to affect the entire world, given the spillover effects now seen across regions. We are therefore convinced that the only way forward is to de-escalate tensions, resume dialogue and negotiation through all channels, with a view to achieving long-term solutions that take into consideration the interest and concern of all parties, in accordance with the international law. There is no viable alternative. International efforts should be carried out in a prudent manner in order to be conducive to reaching a final solution. Discussion and decisions undertaken by international organizations and agencies should follow their established procedures and working methods. In this vein, we have the view that the deliberation and decisions taken by the General Assembly should be based on impartial information, broad consultations with member states, dialogue and negotiations among related parties is the most feasible way forward to a peaceful, comprehensive solution. It is our hope that the United Nations and member states will work together toward this end. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Vietnam. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cambodia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm taking the floor to explain our vote on the draft resolution on the suspension of the rights of membership of the Russian Federation in the Human Rights Council after the vote. The spectrum of isolation of a member state through the suspension of its right in a UN body will not help resolve the conflict, but only trigger and intensify the situation. After a fragile time for world peace, security, and stability, the engagement among the member states in all relevant UN bodies, including Human Rights Council, is very important. Resolving the conflict in Ukraine based on the UN Charter and the international law through creating a conducive environment for diplomatic engagement and negotiation by the concerned parties should be the right path to be focused toward ending the tremendous human suffering and achieving a sustainable, peaceful solution in Ukraine. At this critical juncture, we must try to work in solidarity to address the conflict in Ukraine and to avoid creating a trust deficit among the membership. Building trust and confidence is absolutely important to deal with the current situation. With that explanation, Cambodia voted abstain on resolution L4. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cambodia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Uzbekistan.
Mr. President, Uzbekistan adheres to a balanced, neutral position on the current situation in Ukraine and hope that the parties will find mutually acceptable way to resolve the situation pursuing solely a political and diplomatic path based on the universally recognized principle and norms of international law. At the same time, the delegation of Uzbekistan voted against the resolution on suspension of the right of membership of the Russian Federation in the Human Rights Council, given our strong convictions that any decision under OP8 of the GA Resolution 60/251 authorizing General Assembly by 2/3 majority of the members present and voting suspend the right of membership in the Council of a member of the Council that commits gross and systematic violation of human rights should be based on the outcome of thorough investigation of the alleged violation. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Uzbekistan. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malaysia.
Mr. President, Malaysia remains deeply concerned with the worsening situation in Ukraine and continues to closely monitor developments, including the humanitarian situation on the ground. We are greatly disturbed with reports of alleged human rights abuses and violations. We firmly believe that those who commit gross violations of human rights must be held accountable. We also firmly believe that it is imperative that such atrocities be verified in an impartial, transparent, and credible manner. In this regard, we support the call by the Secretary General to immediately commence independent investigations to guarantee effective accountability. Thus, Malaysia is of the view that the critical decision, such as the suspension of a member of the Human Rights Council, must not be made in haste and should not prejudge the outcome of such investigations. A decision of such an important matter must be accorded the same equal treatment and due processes as in the past in the full spirit and letter of the Resolution 60/251. Taking into account all the aforementioned considerations, Malaysia has decided to abstain on the resolution presented today. Mr. President, Malaysia strongly urges all concerned parties to immediately take steps to de-escalate, continue to progress towards dialogue and negotiations to prevent further loss of lives and devastation. We reiterate the need to respect and protect civilian life and infrastructure. We also reiterate the call on all parties to fully comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Malaysia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Singapore.
Mr. President, Singapore abstained on the resolution that has just been adopted. Singapore condemns in the strongest possible terms the Russian Federation's invasion of Ukraine and continuing attacks on Ukrainian cities, civilians, and civilian infrastructure. We reiterate our full support for the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Singapore's position on this has been clear and consistent from the beginning of this war. This is why we co-sponsored and voted in support of Resolution ES-11/1, Resolution ES-11/2, and also co-sponsored Human Rights Council Resolution 49/1. Mr. President, Singapore is gravely concerned and distressed by the latest reports and images from Bucha and other Ukrainian towns of high civilian casualties and destruction of civilian infrastructure. We strongly condemn any violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. In this regard, we urge the full and urgent implementation of Resolution ES-11/1, Resolution ES-11/2, and Human Rights Council Resolution 49/1. In particular, we note the establishment of an independent international commission of inquiry to investigate all alleged violations of abuses of human rights in Ukraine and await the completion of its work and its findings. There must be accountability for any gross and systematic human rights violations that have taken place in the war in Ukraine. We urge all parties to cooperate with the Commission and allow full and unhindered access for the Commission to gather evidence and conduct its work. We must spare no effort to protect the civilian population in Ukraine and to ensure safe and unhindered humanitarian access to all those in need. We continue to call on the Russian Federation to cease its offensive military operations immediately, to remain engaged in meaningful negotiations with Ukraine, and to work towards a peaceful settlement in accordance with the UN Charter and international law. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Singapore. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brunei Darussalam.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Mr. President, Brunei Darussalam expresses concern over the escalation of tension and military action in Ukraine and continues to closely monitor developments in the country. Brunei Darussalam condemns any violation of sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of any country and reiterates the importance of upholding the principle of a rule-based framework and respect the international law. Brunei Darussalam strongly believes that constructive dialogue and engagement among all parties concerned is essential to seek a peaceful solution. We further believe that the suspension of member states is counterproductive in addressing any concern and may further aggravate the already dire situation. Brunei Darussalam reiterates the importance of diplomacy and further calls on all parties directly involved to de-escalate tension and settle all differences by peaceful means without resorting to the threat or use of force in accordance with the UN Charter and international law in the interest of maintaining international peace and stability. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Brunei Darussalam. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kuwait.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. لقد صوتت دولة الكويت بالامتناع عن التصويت على مشروع القرار الذي تم اعتماده للتو في هذه الجلسة الاستثنائية الطارئة للجمعية العامة انطلاقا من التزامها بتعزيز وحماية حقوق الإنسان والحفاظ على الأجهزة الدولية المنشأة لهذا الغرض من التسييس والانتقائية وازدواجية المعايير وتشجيع الحوار وانتهاج الموضوعية عند تناول مسائل حقوق الإنسان وفي الوقت الذي ندين فيه جميع انتهاكات القانون الدولي الإنساني وانتهاكات حقوق الإنسان من أي طرف كان وفي أي مكان فإننا تابعنا وبقلق بالغ التقارير والصور المفزعة التي تم تداولها في وسائل الإعلام منذ أيام قليلة والتي كشفت عن حجم التجاوزات والانتهاكات الخطيرة والجسيمة للقانون الإنساني الدولي والقانون الدولي لحقوق الإنسان المرتكبة بحق المدنيين العزل في أوكرانيا. ونؤيد في هذا الشأن دعوة الأمين العام للأمم المتحدة لإجراء تحقيق دولي مستقل ومحايد وشفاف في هذه الجرائم وتحديد المسؤولين عنها ومحاسبتهم. ونجدد دعوتنا لأطراف النزاع بأن تحترم التزاماتها بموجب القانون الدولي الإنساني بما في ذلك اتفاقيات جنيف لعام 1949 والبروتوكولات الإضافية الملحقة بها والقانون الدولي للاجئين لحماية المدنيين والأعيان المدنية واحترام وحماية العاملين في المجال الطبي والإنساني وقوافل الإغاثة الإنسانية بضمان إيصال المساعدات إلى المحتاجين بدون أي عراقيل ونشيد هنا بجهود الأمم المتحدة ووكالاتها المتخصصة لتخفيف المعاناة الإنسانية الناجمة عن استمرار الأعمال العدائية ومنع تفاقمها. السيد الرئيس، منذ بداية اندلاع الحرب والعمليات العسكرية في أوكرانيا أكدت الكويت على موقفها المبدئي والثابت في الالتزام بمبادئ ميثاق الأمم المتحدة الداعية إلى احترام سيادة الدول واستقلالها
وسلامتها
United
الإقليمية
Nations principles,
وعدم
respect the
التدخل في الشؤون
territorial integrity
الداخلية
and dependence and
والامتناع
sovereignty
عن
of states
استخدام
and
القوة أو
non-interference
التهديد
in their
باستخدامها
internal affairs.
والعمل على حل
We
النزاعات
must not
بالطرق
use
والوسائل
force
السلمية
or
ونجدد هنا
use
الدعوة
threat
إلى
of
وقف
force
فوري
and
للأعمال
end conflicts
العدائية
by peaceful means.
واستمرار
We
المفاوضات بين
renew our
الأطراف
appeal
المعنية
to
من أجل
end
التوصل إلى
hostilities and
تسوية
to
سلمية
undertake
وتجنيب
negotiations
المنطقة
between the
والعالم
parties in
تداعياتها
question
السلبية
in order to
الاقتصادية
reach a
والإنسانية.
peaceful
وشكرا
solution
السيد الرئيس.
to spare the world and the region from any serious repercussions. Thank
I
you.
thank the distinguished representative of Kuwait. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kyrgyzstan.
Mr. President, according to paragraph 8 of the UN General Assembly Resolution 60/251, Human Rights Council, the General Assembly may suspend the rights of membership in the Human Rights Council of a member of the Council that commits gross and systematic violations of human rights. This paragraph requires that there should be confirmed facts of gross and systematic violations of human rights. Our position at the moment is that we should wait for the results of impartial investigations into all possible gross and systematic violations of human rights in Ukraine, including the results of the investigation of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry, established by the resolution of the UN Human Rights Council number 49/1. We are following the situation in Ukraine with great concern. It is especially alarming that fraternal peoples are involved in this conflict and human casualties could not be avoided. We express our grave concern over the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Ukraine. In this regard, it is important to ensure the full protection of civilians, primarily women and children, as well as medical and humanitarian personnel. What is happening today, it is a real tragedy, the occurrence of which, unfortunately, was allowed by the entire world community. Kyrgyzstan expresses the opinion that the text of the draft resolution under consideration today on the suspension of membership of the Russian Federation in the UN Human Rights Council is characterized as politically driven. We are in favor of conducting an independent investigation, examining the results and facts provided by both sides. Mr. President, our position is clear. Any conflict must be resolved exclusively by political and diplomatic means, including through the creation of new formats and mechanisms. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Kyrgyzstan. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. تجدد الجزائر التزامها الثابت بالقواعد والمبادئ الأساسية للقانون الدولي الإنساني والقانون الدولي لحقوق الإنسان، لا سيما الإعلان العالمي لحقوق الإنسان ومختلف المعاهدات الدولية لحماية وترقية حقوق الإنسان، وتعبر عن إدانتها الشديدة لكل الانتهاكات المتحقق منها للالتزامات الدولية في هذا المجال، مما لا شك فيه أن الصور المتداولة في بعض المدن الأوكرانية مروعة ومدانة بشدة، والجرائم المزعومة التي تترتب عنها بالغة الخطورة، لكن بات من الضروري كذلك السماح للآليات الأممية المختصة بالتحقيق في الوقائع على أرض الواقع بطريقة محايدة حتى يتسنى إقرار العدالة لجميع الضحايا الأبرياء. إن ضمان قيام آليات الأمم المتحدة المختصة بولاياتها ومهامها وفقا لقواعد القانون الدولي وقرارات الأمم المتحدة ذات الصلة، بعيدا عن أي تدخل أو حكم مسبق، يشكل بالنسبة للجزائر شرطا لا غنى عنه لإثبات الوقائع بشأن أي انتهاكات صارخة وممنهجة لحقوق الإنسان. وفي هذا الصدد تدعو الجزائر إلى احترام مبادئ العالمية الموضوعية واللا انتقائية التي تشكل حجر الزاوية في عمل مجلس حقوق الإنسان، مع النأي بهذا الأخير عن أي تجاذبات سياسية من شأنها التأثير على دور ومهام هذه الهيئة الأممية المحورية وتعاطيها الحيادي مع مسائل حقوق الإنسان بما يعزز سبل الحوار والتعاون البناءين. ويرى وفد بلادي أن الجهود الدولية المتعددة الأطراف تستوجب تعزيز الحوار والتعاون بعيدا عن أي إقصاء بغض النظر عن اختلافات المواقف ومدى تبايناتها. إن الرغبة في تعليق عضوية أي دولة منتخبة من قبل المجموعة الدولية ومن أي هيئة أممية ليس من شأنه أن يساهم في تعزيز روح العمل والتعاون متعدد الأطراف. إن الجزائر التي تؤكد مجددا دعمها للمفاوضات المباشرة بين روسيا وأوكرانيا من أجل وقف العمليات العسكرية والتكفل العاجل بالأزمة الإنسانية تجدد دعوتها لتكثيف الجهود الدبلوماسية الدولية الرامية لحل الأزمة الراهنة بما يمكن من منع الانهيار المتزايد للمعايير الدبلوماسية والتوصل في أقرب وقت ممكن إلى حل سياسي يضمن الحفاظ على سيادة الدول وسلامة أراضيها ومصالحها الحيوية المشروعة. إن بلادي التي انخرطت بحسن نية في جهود المساعي الحميدة في إطار مجموعة الاتصال العربية التي اجتمعت مؤخرا بالأطراف المعنية تهيب بالمجتمع الدولي الامتناع عن أي عمل من شأنه أن يحيق المفاوضات الجارية ويطيل أمد الأزمة التي أصبحت الآن عواقبها الوخيمة وبأبعادها المتعددة تؤثر سلبا على جميع دول العالم. وعلى أساس هذه الأسباب وهذه الاعتبارات فإن وفد الجزائر صوت ضد مشروع القرار. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Algeria. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Peru.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President.
El Perú ha votado a favor del proyecto A/ES-11/L4 pensando en las víctimas y en el entendido que la decisión adoptada se fundamenta en las facultades generales de la Asamblea General contenidas en el artículo 10 de la Carta y de manera específica en el artículo 8 de la Resolución 60/251 de la Asamblea, que la faculta con una mayoría de 2/3 a suspender la membresía de un Estado miembro en el Consejo de Derechos Humanos cuando éste haya incurrido en graves y sistemáticas violaciones a los derechos humanos. El acto de agresión y el uso de la fuerza contra la soberanía y la integridad territorial de un Estado comporta de suyo un patrón de violación de los derechos humanos de la población afectada. El gobierno del Perú considera que este procedimiento, aplicado por segunda vez en la historia del Consejo de Derechos Humanos, debe ejercerse sin ningún criterio de selectividad ni discriminación de naturaleza alguna. La suspensión en el futuro debería invocarse en toda situación análoga al presente caso, donde concurran los actos de uso de la fuerza, violación de la integridad territorial de otro Estado y violaciones de los derechos humanos. En ese contexto, el de una resolución adoptada en el ámbito de las responsabilidades y el mandato de la Asamblea General, el gobierno del Perú considera que ella no prejuzga las acciones de tutela que están realizando o pueden realizar los diversos mecanismos del Consejo de Derechos Humanos. Estas investigaciones deben realizarse sin ningún tipo de predeterminación política, con independencia, neutralidad y en función exclusiva de los derechos de las víctimas, su protección y la lucha contra la impunidad. De manera particular, La delegación del Perú considera que la resolución adoptada no debe prejuzgar ni predeterminar políticamente las labores de la Comisión Internacional Independiente que el Consejo de Derechos Humanos ha establecido con el mandato de investigar las presuntas violaciones a los derechos humanos y el derecho humanitario que tiene lugar en el contexto del conflicto armado en Ucrania, independientemente de las partes responsables de las violaciones que puedan determinarse. Estas investigaciones deben realizarse bajo los principios reconocidos internacionalmente de independencia, celeridad, objetividad y no discriminación. Esto es más urgente e imperativo para la investigación de las matanzas producidas en la localidad de Bucha. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
I thank the distinguished representative of Peru. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia.
لقد امتنع وفد المملكة العربية السعودية عن التصويت على مشروع القرار المعنون بتعليق عضوية روسيا لدى مجلس حقوق الإنسان بكون هذا الإجراء يشكل سابقة تهدد العمل المتعدد الأطراف وتنافي مبادئ القانون الدولي ويؤثر على عمل المنظمات الدولية وشموليتها واستقلاليتها. السيد الرئيس، بينما تتابع بلادي ببالغ القلق والأسف ما آلت إليه تداعيات الأوضاع في جمهورية أوكرانيا لا سيما الإنسانية منها، فإن المملكة العربية السعودية تدين كافة انتهاكات القانون الدولي الإنساني بجميع صوره وأشكاله أينما كانت، وتؤمن بأهمية حماية المدنيين والمواقع المدنية في مناطق النزاعات، إلا أنه في الوقت ذاته فإن بلادي تنظر إلى أن التوجه نحو تعليق عضوية روسيا في مجلس حقوق الإنسان باعتباره خطوة تصعيدية من شأنها أن تزيد من حدة الأوضاع المتوترة في الأساس، وأن هذه الخطوة لا تسيس عمل المجلس فحسب بل تجعله ذو طابع أحادي لا يعطي اهتماما للأطراف الأخرى للدفاع عن مواقفها. السيد الرئيس، تؤكد بلادي على حق الدول المنتخبة لعضوية مجلس حقوق الإنسان أن تمارس صلاحياتها كاملة وفقا لما نص عليه قرار الجمعية العامة رقم 60 تقسيم 251 المعنون مجلس حقوق الإنسان، الذي أكد على أن الجمعية العامة تسلم عند النظر في قضايا حقوق الإنسان بمبادئ العالمية واللا انتقائية والقضاء على أسلوب المعايير المزدوجة والتسييس. ختاما، السيد الرئيس، يأتي امتناع بلادي عن التصويت نابعا من إيمانها بأن هذا القرار من شأنه أن يؤدي إلى تأجيج الصراع وتصعيد الموقف الذي سيؤثر سلبا على مسار الحوار القائم حاليا بين أطراف النزاع للوصول إلى تسوية سلمية تجنب المنطقة والعالم المزيد من التداعيات السلبية لهذا الصراع سواء سياسيا أو اقتصاديا أو إنسانيا. شكرا السيد الرئيس.
I thank the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Thank you, Mr. President. The United Arab Emirates reiterates again our forceful condemnation of all violations of international humanitarian law committed in Ukraine. Civilians are bearing the brunt of this conflict, and this must end, and they must be spared, and parties must comply with their obligations under international law. Determining the facts on the ground is important for justice to be rendered to victims, but also in the longer term to allow communities to heal, to reconcile, and to build sustainable peace. As a member of the Human Rights Council, we voted in favor of Resolution 49/1, urgently establishing an international independent commission of inquiry to investigate all alleged violations and abuses of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law in Ukraine. The members of the commission were appointed on the 30th of March, and their investigations have only just begun. Due process demands that investigative mechanisms be able to conclude their work. Today, we decided to abstain on this resolution because we need to ensure that any decision we take in this General Assembly is based on due process in line with Resolution 60/251. The United Nations is based on the premise of dialogue and constructive engagement with each other, and even with those who hold opposing views to us. The organizations that make up our international system were not established to be a club for the like-minded. We need to preserve spaces in the multilateral arena to talk to each other and not just at each other. And that idea is in the foundational DNA of this organization. Our collective strength lies in our inclusivity. So now is the time to double down on diplomatic outreach in order to reach an immediate cessation of hostilities throughout Ukraine. And we support the ongoing negotiations between Ukraine and Russia and offer our full support to all mediation efforts. Now it is time to find a way through this conflict towards peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Arab Emirates. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kiribati.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for convening us on this emergency session to deliberate on a draft resolution that's already been passed, which has the effect of suspending a member of the Human Rights Council in line with the provision in a past General Assembly resolution that allows the General Assembly to suspend the rights of a member to sit and participate in the Human Rights Council if such member has committed gross violations of human rights. Having listened intently to the reasoning advanced from the two sides of this issue, Kiribati decided to vote in support of the resolution on the following grounds. First, the images of hundreds or thousands of human beings killed, of innocent human beings killed in Ukraine during the course of the past 42 days is a heart and soul-breaking nightmare for all normal, conscientious, and peace-loving human beings. And we do join all peace-loving people of the world in their prayers and calls for a speedy ending to the conflict through friendly and diplomatic dialogue between the parties. As a long-standing member of the Commonwealth of Nations, we believe it is a wise and civilized practice to encourage all its members to be loyal and faithful to the codes of conduct of the Commonwealth, which requires all its members to respect the rules of law, good governance, and the rights and freedoms of human persons, and to deter violations of such codes of conduct through suspension of any defaulting member, and at the same time allowing time and space for a suspended member to reform its conduct and get back to the agreed code of human conduct. This practice has worked very well in the Commonwealth for decades, and we believe it can also work well for the United Nations on any member who is seen by an overwhelming majority of members to have seriously digressed from the codes of conduct for UN membership. The suspension of Libya in the Human Rights Council in the past show that it is not entirely wrong to agree to a suspension decision at this time. Once again, we join the whole humanity in calling on the parties concerned to put down their arms and to come together and become part of one happy global human family. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Kiribati. We have heard the last speaker in explanations of vote after the vote. We'll now hear statements after the adoption of the resolution. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Russian Federation.
Благодарю вас, господин председатель.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Российская сторона рассматривает
Russian Federation
принятую
considers
Генеральной Ассамблеей ООН
the
резолюцию о
resolution adopted by
приостановлении
the General Assembly
членства
on the
Российской
suspension
Федерации
of
в
the
Совете ООН
membership
по
of the
правам
Russian
человека
Federation in the Human
в
Rights
качестве
Council
неправомерного
as an
и
illegitimate
политически
and
мотивированного
politically
шага в целях
motivated step
демонстративного
with the
наказания
aim of
суверенного государства
demonstratively
члена ООН,
punishing a sovereign member state of the
осуществляющего
UN,
независимую внутреннюю
conducting an
и внешнюю
independent
политику.
domestic and foreign policy.
Я уполномочен сделать следующее заявление.
I am authorized to make the following statement.
Российская Федерация
The Russian Federation
приняла решение
made a
о досрочном
decision
прекращении 7
about,
апреля 2022 года
about ending
своих полномочий
suspending
члена
its
Совета ООН по правам
its
человека.
membership in the Human Rights Council before the end of
Россия
its
всегда
term on the
рассматривала
7th of
Совет ООН по
April
правам
of
человека в
this year.
качестве
Russia has always
важного
considered the
компонента
Human Rights
универсальной
Council as
системы
an important
поощрения и
component of
защиты
the
прав
universal
человека.
system of promoting and
Главная роль
protecting human
которого
rights,
заключается в
whose main
содействии
role
развитию
is
конструктивного и
to
максимально
contribute to the
деполитизированного
development of
международного
a
диалога
constructive and maximally
по ключевым
depoliticized international
вопросам
intergovernmental
правозащитной
dialogue
повестки
on
дня.
key issues of the human
К
rights
сожалению,
agenda.
в современных
Unfortunately,
условиях Совет фактически
today's conditions,
монополизирован
the
одной группой
Council
государств,
is in fact monopolized by
использующих
one
его
group
в
of
своих
states
конъюнктурных
who
целях,
use it for their short-term aims.
провозгласившие себя эталоном в
Now, those
правозащитной сфере,
who have
эти государства
claimed that
долгие
they are
годы
the standard in
непосредственно
the human
участвуют
rights
в
field,
совершении
these
грубых
states for
и
many
массовых
years have
нарушений прав
directly
человека,
been
либо
involved
потворствуют
in
этому.
blatant and massive violations of human rights
Несмотря
or
на свой
abetted
статус
those
членов Совета,
violations. In spite of its
они не
membership,
готовы
their
поступиться
membership
своими
as members of
корыстными
the Council, they're
политическими и
not
экономическими
ready
интересами
to
ради реального содействия стабилизации правозащитной
sacrifice
ситуации в
their
отдельных странах.
short-term political and economic interests in favor of true cooperation in stabilizing the human rights
Такие действия
situation in
нарушают
certain
мандат,
countries.
возложенный
Such
международным
actions
сообществом
violate the
на Совет
mandate
ООН по
entrusted
правам
by the
человека и в
international
целом
community
подрывают
on
к
the
нему
Human Rights
доверие.
Council and overall undermine trust in this body.
Искренняя приверженность России делу
The
защиты и
sincere commitment
поощрения
of
прав
Russia
человека не
to
позволяет нам дольше
promoting and
оставаться
protecting of
частью
human rights does not
международного
make it possible for
механизма,
us to remain a member
превратившегося
of
в
an
исполнителя
international
воли
mechanism
указанной
which has
группы стран,
become a
которые для продавливания своих целей и
an
получения
enabler
необходимых
of the
голосов
will of
при
the
принятии
above-mentioned
решений
group of
не
countries, which,
гнушаются
in order to
открытым
push through their
шантажом
aims
суверенных
and
государств.
achieve the necessary amount of votes in adopting this decision, have resorted to open blackmail
Принятое
of
нами
sovereign
решение
states.
досрочно
The
прекратить
decision,
членство в
our
Совете ООН по
decision
правам
to
человека не является
to
отступлением
stop our
от
membership
международных
in
обязательств
the
России в
Human Rights Council
правозащитной
before
сфере.
the end of our term does not mean that we are not going to continue
Российская Федерация
fulfilling our
и далее намерена вносить
international
весомый вклад в
obligations
укрепление
in the human rights
конструктивного
field.
диалога
The Russian
по правам
Federation will
человека,
continue to
вовлечение всех
make
заинтересованных
its
сторон
significant
в процесс
contribution in
коллективной
strengthening
выработки и принятия
constructive
решений,
dialogue on human rights and
отвечающих
involving all
интересам
interested
всех
sides
групп
in the
государств.
process of collective
Я благодарю вас,
development
господин
and
председатель.
adoption of decisions that meet the interests of all groups of states. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Thank you, Mr. President, for convening us under the emergency special session. I have the privilege to address the General Assembly on behalf of the European Union and its member states, North Macedonia, Montenegro, and Albania, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Iceland and Norway, as well as Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Georgia, Andorra, Monaco, and San Marino align themselves with this statement. Mr. President, the scale and gravity of Russia's violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law, as well as the violations of the UN Charter and the territorial integrity and sovereignty of another state, Ukraine, call for strong, united international response. Russia is responsible for a horrific number of casualties human suffering, and forced displacements. Russian armed forces have been relentlessly shelling cities, schools, hospitals for well over a month now. The Russian authorities are responsible for the crimes committed while they have effective control of many areas inside Ukraine. They are subject to international law of occupation. The European Union supports all measures to ensure accountability for human rights violations and violations of international humanitarian law in Ukraine by Russian armed forces. The perpetrators of war crimes and other serious violations, as well as the responsible government officials and military leaders, will be held accountable. Today, this Assembly has decided that for now the Russian Federation is suspended from the Human Rights Council. Membership in that council is and shall remain open to all member states of the United Nations. But those members commit to uphold the highest standards in the promotion and protection of human rights. Russia has violated those criteria through its activities in Ukraine. The decision to suspend the Russian Federation, which the EU and its member states have supported today, implements the 2006 General Assembly resolution establishing the Human Rights Council, which foresees suspension of members that commit gross and systematic violations of human rights. Suspension is necessary to uphold the integrity of the Human Rights Council, the authority of the General Assembly, and the credibility of the UN human rights system. The rare decision this Assembly has taken today sends a strong signal of accountability and hopefully will help preventing and discouraging more violations of human rights. For the third time in a month, the UN General Assembly has adopted a resolution on Ukraine by a clear majority. Once again, the international community stands in solidarity with the people of Ukraine and all other people affected by the war of Russian aggression. Once again, the international community strongly calls on Russia to cease the destruction of innocent lives across Ukraine and immediately and unconditionally withdraw all its troops. While the Security Council remains unable to take action because of the Russian veto, the General Assembly has demonstrated the strength of international support towards addressing the Russian aggression against Ukraine. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of European Union. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Netherlands on behalf of Benelux countries.
President, I deliver this statement on behalf of the Benelux countries, Belgium, Luxembourg, and my own country, the Netherlands. The Benelux countries align themselves with the statement just made by the European Union. Mr. President, the Benelux countries remain unwavering in their support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, and its democratic freedom. We condemn in the strongest terms the unprovoked war of aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine. Mr. President, it is the third time that we meet in this emergency special session in just over a month. Today, like before, the exceptional circumstances caused by the war in Ukraine leave us no other choice. We meet because we are horrified by the reports of atrocities committed by the Russian armed forces in Ukraine, by the images from places like Bucha, Starye-Bykhiv, Mariupol, and Hostomel that show a complete disregard for human rights and the lives of civilians, and by the personal testimonies of rape and sexual violence that are emerging. Clearly, these actions are unacceptable for any UN member state, but even more so for a member of the Human Rights Council. It is therefore important that the General Assembly has just voted to take the exceptional step to suspend the membership of the Russian Federation of the Human Rights Council. It is important because membership of the Council comes with responsibilities and duties. Resolution 60/251, which established the Council, clearly states that Council members shall, and I quote, uphold the highest standards in the promotion and protection of human rights. Holding a seat in the Human Rights Council is not a free ride. The Benelux countries, as recent and current members of the Human Rights Councils,
are strong supporters of its mandate, and we note that members sign up to a heightened level of public scrutiny and commit to engage with the Council in a spirit of dialogue, cooperation and self-reflection, grounded in a desire to use their membership to strengthen the enjoyment of human rights at home and abroad. It is clear that with its actions in Ukraine, the Russian Federation is failing its responsibilities as a member of the Human Rights Council. But, Mr. President, this is not just about the Human Rights Council. What is at stake is the credibility of the UN as a whole. The UN Secretary General, in his statement to the Security Council on Tuesday, clearly stated that the war in Ukraine is one of the greatest challenges ever to the international order and the global peace architecture that was founded on the United Nations Charter. That is what is at stake if we allow the Russian Federation to commit these crimes without consequences. In its resolution on March the 2nd, the General Assembly called upon the Russian Federation to abide by the principles set forth in the Charter. And yet, we are confronted with the opposite, further violations of that same Charter. Mr. President, my final point is on accountability. I am repeating the call by the UN Secretary General and the High Commissioner for Human Rights that all efforts be made to ensure an independent and effective investigation into what happened in Bucha and other places. We therefore fully support the work of the Commission of Inquiry that was established by the Human Rights Council and the essential role of the International Criminal Court when it comes to investigating possible war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. These efforts complement the investigations undertaken by the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, which the EU stands ready to support. So let's be clear, the perpetrators of these crimes are being watched and evidence is being compiled with a view to their prosecution. We owe it to the victims and the family to find the truth and to provide justice and accountability. Mr. President, there is of course a solution to stop these atrocities. The Russian Federation chose to start this war of aggression against Ukraine. It can also choose to stop it, to immediately cease hostilities, withdraw its troops, and fully respect international humanitarian and human rights law. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Netherlands. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lithuania on behalf of the Baltic countries.
United Kingdom, point of order. So, point of order.
There is a point of order requested by the United Kingdom, and I would wish now to give the floor to the United Kingdom for the point of order.
Many thanks, Mr. President. We're very sorry to take the floor and interrupt the flow of statements, but we would like to seek urgent clarification from the Russian delegation as to what precisely they just said in their statement. This General Assembly voted just a few moments ago to suspend them from the Human Rights Council, and that is now done. But it seemed to us that they were suggesting that they were also withdrawing from the Human Rights Council, which has a different effect. Now, setting aside the fact that that sounds like someone who has just been fired, tendering their resignation, may we just ask the Russian delegation to be precise on this point? Are they going to be sending a note verbale to member states and to the relevant authorities indicating their full and formal withdrawal from the Human Rights Council for the remainder of their term? We think that has a different effect in terms of the next actions that need to be taken and their status. Thank you, Mr. President.
I will now give the floor to the Russian Federation if they so wish to clarify. You have the floor.
Спасибо, господин председатель.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Мы хотели бы пояснить,
would like
что
to
заданный только
explain
что вопрос
that the question that was just
не
asked
относится к порядку ведения заседания,
is
а
not
имеет отношение
does
к
not refer to a
субстантивной
point of
части
order,
нашего
but
выступления.
in fact it refers to the substantive part of our statement.
Мы сделали достаточно четкое
I think we
заявление.
made a
Благодарю за
very
внимание.
clear statement. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. I note that France is asking floor for the point of order, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Mon
Thank
intervention
you,
n'est pas liée au point d'ordre, mais peut-être que
Mr. President. My
les
intervention is not related to
les interprètes pourraient donner la précision. Nous pensons qu'il y a
point of
une
order. Maybe
divergence entre la
interpreters can
version anglaise et
clarify.
la
I think
version
there
française,
might be some
puisque nous avons posé la
divergences
question
between
également de
French and
ce
English
qu'était
versions because
réellement
we were also
la
wondering
déclaration
exactly
de
what
la Fédération de
was
Russie.
the
Merci.
statement of the Russian Federation. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of France for the statement. We have heard the last speaker in the statement after adoption of for this meeting. We shall hear the remaining speakers this afternoon at 3 p.m. in this hall. The meeting is adjourned.
Gracias.